My husband looked me in the eye at a charity gala and whispered that he had frozen our joint accounts, filed for divorce, and was taking the 28-year-old executive standing next to him on a corporate retreat instead of me. He smirked, adding that I was always terrible with money anyway. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I asked a waiter for a glass of sparkling water, took a sip, and walked out. Before I tell you how the pay stubs from the company I built 15 years ago destroyed him in front of a judge, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Samantha Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy it. I would love to know, how old are you, and where are you watching from? My name is Ariel Chavez. I'm 45 years old. The string quartet played a delicate Vivaldi piece, but the refined atmosphere of the Raleigh Charity Gala was abruptly punctured by a sharp electronic chirp. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pierce," the attendant murmured, her cheeks flushing beneath the dim crystal lighting. "It seems to be declining. Shall I try running it again?" I stared at the small digital screen on the tablet. I had just placed a winning bid on a silent auction item, a vibrant oil canvas depicting the Outer Banks shoreline. My titanium card, the one linked to a joint account that held more than enough to buy the entire gallery, sat useless in the young woman's trembling hand. "Please do," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The attendant swiped it a second time. Another harsh chirp echoed over the hum of polite conversation. Before I could reach into my clutch for a backup, a familiar hand rested on the edge of the linen-draped table. Donovan. My husband of 15 years wore his custom tuxedo with the practiced ease of a man who loved being noticed. But my eyes bypassed his sharp lapels and landed on the woman standing a fraction of an inch too close to his side, Kendra Sloan. At 28, Kendra was the newest executive at Donovan's logistics tech firm. She wore a backless emerald gown and an overly sweet, cloying floral perfume that immediately coated the back of my throat. "Don't bother running it a third time," Donovan told the attendant, his tone smooth and polished. He turned his gaze to me. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a clinical, predatory satisfaction. He stepped into my personal space, forcing me to breathe in Kendra's perfume. "I filed the paperwork this morning," Donovan whispered, his voice pitched low enough that only the three of us could hear. "The joint accounts are frozen. The credit lines are suspended." I didn't blink. The Vivaldi piece seemed to stretch thin in the chilled air of the ballroom. "I'm taking Kendra on the Aspen corporate retreat tomorrow," he continued, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My lawyer will be in touch about the Carey house. You should probably start packing." Kendra offered a tight, patronizing smile, her manicured fingers resting lightly on Donovan's forearm. It was a rehearsed pose, a hostile takeover disguised as high society gossip. Donovan tilted his head, leaning just a breath closer to deliver the final blow. "You were always terrible with money anyway, Ariel." He waited. He squared his shoulders, preparing for the slap, the tears, the hysterical scene that would allow him to play the exhausted, long-suffering husband in front of the Research Triangle's elite. He wanted me to shatter. He needed me to shatter to justify his narrative. I looked at the declined card on the table, then up at my husband. I felt the sudden stinging burn of betrayal, but beneath it, a cold, metallic calm locked firmly into place. A waiter passed by with a silver tray. I reached out, lifting a crystal flute of sparkling water. The condensation was freezing against my fingertips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the icy liquid settle my racing pulse. "Keep the card," I told the attendant softly. I didn't look at Kendra. I didn't grant Donovan a single parting word. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the grand double doors. My posture was flawless, my exit unhurried, the rhythmic click of my heels fading into the music. Left standing by the auction table, Donovan's grin faltered. The lack of a scene didn't feel like a victory. As the heavy mahogany doors closed silently behind me, I knew a strange, creeping unease was settling deep in his chest. The drive from downtown Raleigh to the Carey estate took 22 minutes. I counted every single one of them. The leather steering wheel of my car felt cold under my palms. The dashboard clock glowed a faint blue in the dark cabin. I did not turn on the radio. I needed the silence to process the sheer audacity of what had just happened in that ballroom. For a decade and a half, I had curated a flawless life for my husband. I managed his calendar, smiled at his investors, and maintained the polished image required to thrive in the Research Triangle tech scene. Now he was replacing me with a 28-year-old junior executive and locking me out of my own life. The wrought iron gates of our estate swung open. The property was a sprawling Tudor-style home tucked behind ancient oak trees. Donovan loved this house because it looked like old money. I tolerated it because the backyard had enough space for the twins to practice soccer on the weekends. As my headlights swept across the circular driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar commercial van parked near the grand entryway. The front door stood wide open, spilling warm yellow light onto the manicured lawn. I stepped inside and stopped dead in the foyer. The space usually held a quiet elegance, but tonight it looked like a loading dock. Stacks of heavy corrugated cardboard boxes lined the imported marble floors. Rolls of packing tape and sheets of bubble wrap littered the Persian rug. Standing in the center of the chaos was Bridget. Donovan's younger sister wore a tailored blazer and held a clipboard like a weapon. Bridget was a luxury real estate agent who treated every human interaction as a networking opportunity or a transaction. She looked up from her clipboard and offered a smile that belonged on a billboard. "Oh, good, you made it back early," Bridget said. Her tone was bright and entirely devoid of warmth. "The movers charge double after 9 o'clock, so I told them to just focus on the main floor tonight." I stared at the boxes. My breathing remained steady. "What are you doing in my house, Bridget?" she sighed, acting as if I were a difficult client. "It is Donovan's house, Ariel. He called me an hour ago to handle the logistics. You have exactly 3 days to vacate the premises. Kendra is moving in by the weekend, and she wants to start redecorating immediately. The guest rooms are far too outdated for her taste." I watched a man in a moving company uniform carry an armful of my winter coats out the front door. To Bridget, I was nothing more than a placeholder. She had always resented me. When Donovan and I first met, Bridget was drowning in credit card debt trying to keep up with the local elite. I bailed her out twice without ever telling Donovan. She repaid that quiet generosity by constantly undermining me at family dinners. Now she was standing in my foyer, facilitating my eviction. Bridget tapped her pen against her clipboard. "Honestly, Ariel, you should be grateful my brother is giving you 72 hours. Most men would have changed the locks tonight. You have been a leech on his success for 15 years. You have not worked a single day since the wedding. Take whatever scraps he offers you and go quietly." A mover walked past, carrying a plastic bin filled with kitchen items. Bridget stopped him and reached inside. She pulled out a chipped ceramic coffee mug. It was hand-painted with crooked blue stars. My daughter Mia had made it for me in a third-grade pottery class. It was the only cup I used every morning. Bridget held it up by the handle with 2 manicured fingers, inspecting it like a piece of garbage. "This is hideous," she muttered. Without a second thought, she tossed it into a nearby cardboard box filled with heavy hardback books. A sharp crack echoed from inside the box. My chest tightened. A hot wave of adrenaline rushed into my throat. Every instinct demanded that I step forward and strike her perfect jawline. I wanted to tear the clipboard from her hands and throw her out the front door. Reacting with rage, however, was exactly what Donovan wanted. He needed me to act unhinged to justify his actions to our social circle. I swallowed the heat rising in my chest and kept my hands relaxed at my sides. Bridget misread my silence as defeat. She offered a look of mock pity. "Do not try to call the twins, by the way." I froze. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "What did you say?" Bridget checked something off on her clipboard. Donovan already spoke to Leo and Mia at their boarding school in Asheville. He told them you are having a severe mental breakdown and need some time alone to seek psychiatric help. He explained that is why you will not be answering their calls. We are just trying to protect the children, Ariel. You understand. The floor tilted beneath my feet. Taking my credit cards was theft. Taking my home was an insult. Poisoning my 14-year-old children against me was an unforgivable declaration of war. Donovan knew how much I loved the twins. He knew I sent them handwritten letters every Tuesday and drove 3 hours to the mountains just to watch their weekend debate tournaments. He was using my children as collateral damage to secure his own reputation. I looked at Bridget. Her eyes sparkled with cruel satisfaction. She wanted me to break down crying. She wanted to call Donovan and report that I was falling apart in the hallway. Instead, I gave her a slow, serene smile. "Please let the movers know they can stop packing the main floor," I said softly. Bridget frowned, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. "Why?" "Because I am only taking one suitcase." I walked past her, ascending the curved oak staircase with deliberate, measured steps. I did not rush. I went into the master bedroom. The space I had shared with Donovan for over a decade felt foreign now. I pulled a sleek black carry-on bag from the closet. I packed 3 changes of clothes, my running shoes, and a simple toiletry kit. I ignored the velvet jewelry boxes holding diamond tennis bracelets and sapphire earrings. I bypassed the designer handbags Donovan had purchased to apologize for his frequent late nights at the office. None of those items belonged to me. They belonged to the illusion of his perfect life. Zipping the suitcase shut, I stepped out of the bedroom and walked to the end of the hallway. I pulled the hidden cord above the guest bathroom, releasing the drop-down stairs to the attic. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. The air up here was thick, smelling strongly of dry cedar and old dust. The solitary bare bulb flickered, casting long, strange shadows across forgotten holiday decorations and archived tax boxes. I navigated through the clutter, moving toward the far back corner beneath the sloping roof. Hidden behind a stack of unused patio cushions sat a vintage leather briefcase. It was dark brown, scuffed along the edges and secured with 2 heavy brass latches. It looked remarkably ordinary. No one would ever guess it held the power to destroy a corporate empire. When I shut down my own digital consultancy 15 years ago to salvage Donovan's failing startup, I packed away my old life. I never threw away the business records. I kept them out of habit, and perhaps out of some buried intuition that I might need to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Pierce. I ran my fingers over the worn leather surface. The briefcase was heavy. It was loaded with unredacted incorporation documents, bank transfer receipts, and a decade and a half of quiet, unacknowledged labor. I picked up the briefcase by its sturdy handle. It felt like holding a loaded weapon. I climbed down the attic stairs, pulled the door shut, and grabbed my small suitcase. When I reached the ground floor, Bridget was still standing in the foyer. She watched me approach, her eyes darting between my minimal luggage and the scuffed leather bag in my hand. "Is that really all you are taking?" Bridget asked. Her voice wavered just a fraction, betraying a hint of unease. My lack of panic was making her nervous. "Yes, Bridget, this is all I need." I walked toward the open front door, stepping out into the cool night air. The crickets chirped softly from the manicured hedges. Before I crossed the threshold, I paused and looked back over my shoulder. "Tell Donovan I hope he enjoys Aspen, and tell him to sleep well while he still can." I walked down the driveway toward my car. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. I had no house. I had no access to the bank accounts. My children were hundreds of miles away listening to lies about my sanity. By all outward appearances, I was a broken woman, walking away with nothing. But as I placed the vintage leather briefcase gently onto the passenger seat, I knew the truth. The eviction was complete, but the war had just begun. The drive down the interstate toward Durham felt like navigating through a dark tunnel. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with enough force to turn my knuckles white. The glowing numbers on the dashboard clock flipped past midnight. I bypassed the luxury hotels closer to the city center and pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of an extended stay motel. It was the kind of place transient workers used. A flickering neon sign buzzed a dull orange glow against the brick exterior. It was a staggering departure from the imported marble and vaulted ceilings of the Carey estate I had just been thrown out of. But tonight, I did not need luxury. I needed anonymity. The lobby smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. The night clerk, a young man wearing headphones, barely glanced in my direction as he slid a plastic key card across the laminate counter. Room 214. I dragged my single suitcase and the heavy vintage leather bag up a narrow outdoor staircase. The humid Carolina air clung to my skin. Inside the room was profoundly ordinary. A beige bedspread covered a firm mattress. A small kitchenette featured a humming refrigerator. I set the scuffed leather bag onto the bed. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Staring at that worn leather pulled me sharply backward through time. 15 years ago, I was 30 years old and sitting at a wobbly veneer dining table in a cramped apartment near downtown Raleigh. Outside, a brutal summer thunderstorm battered the single-pane windows. Inside, Donovan was pacing holes into our cheap rug. He was pale, sweating profusely, and running his trembling hands through his hair. His very first logistics venture was drowning. He had overextended his credit lines, alienated his early backers, and was 48 hours away from defaulting on every single loan. I remember the exact pitch of his voice when he fell into the chair across from me, begging for salvation. I was not a desperate, dependent housewife back then. I was a self-made millionaire. Before I ever wore his diamond ring, I had built a highly lucrative digital marketing and tech consultancy from the ground up. I wrote complex code. I negotiated ruthless contracts. I commanded boardrooms filled with men who constantly underestimated my intellect. When Donovan hit rock bottom, I made a choice that altered the trajectory of my entire existence. I quietly liquidated my firm. I sat at that wobbly table, pulled out a heavy checkbook, and wrote a personal draft for $1.5 million. That money became the sole seed capital for Apex Logistics. But I did not just hand him a fortune and walk away. I spent the next 3 years working 80-hour weeks in the shadows. I coded the original server architecture while he slept. I built the operational framework that made the software functional. Donovan possessed the charisma to pitch investors, but I provided the actual product he was selling. Once the company caught fire, his ego expanded to fill every room he entered. He craved the magazine covers, the keynote speeches, and the prestigious title of visionary founder. I loved him deeply back then, so I stepped back. I let him take the public credit while I stayed home to raise Leo and Mia, ensuring our children never felt the absence of a parent the way we both had growing up. He mistook my quiet devotion for weakness. He mistook my silence for ignorance. He believed his own fabricated narrative. I sat on the edge of the firm motel mattress, bringing myself back to the present. I pulled the vintage briefcase onto my lap. I rested my thumbs against the twin brass latches. The metal was cool against my skin. I pressed down hard. A crisp metallic click echoed through the silent room. The sound was incredibly satisfying. I flipped the heavy lid open. Inside lay a pristine timeline of my actual worth. Manila folders categorized by year contained every piece of evidence Donovan believed I had discarded. I pulled out the top stack. Bank transfer slips authenticating the initial $1.5 million injection. Tax documents bearing my name. Hundreds of pay stubs from my previous consultancy proving my independent wealth long before he ever bought my engagement ring. But the most vital document rested at the very bottom, protected by a clear plastic sleeve. The original unredacted incorporation charter for Apex Logistics. The document clearly stated my status as the 51% majority shareholder. I traced my finger over the faded ink of my own signature. Donovan had spent the last decade introducing me at galas as his lovely, supportive wife, painting a picture of a woman whose greatest achievement was planning charity dinners. He had convinced himself that the lie was reality. He believed he could discard me because he thought I possessed nothing. He had no idea I legally owned the very ground he walked on. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was nearing 1 a.m, but the woman I needed to reach did not care about traditional business hours. Elise Montgomery operated out of a glass high-rise in Charlotte. She was widely considered the most tactical corporate divorce attorney in the state. Opposing counsel feared her because she did not argue emotion. She argued mathematics and corporate law. I dialed her personal cell number. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was crisp, awake, and sharp as a scalpel. "Ariel," she said, bypassing any polite greetings. "Tell me you are not calling to say you signed a settlement offer." "I am sitting in a cheap motel in Durham," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Donovan froze the joint accounts and locked me out of the house. He is taking a 28-year-old junior executive to Aspen tomorrow." I heard Elise exhale a slow, calculated breath over the line. "Excellent," she murmured. "He is arrogant. Arrogant men always leave sloppy paper trails. Tell me you brought the briefcase." "It is sitting open on my lap right now," I said. "Every single pay stub, every bank transfer slip, the original corporate charter. I own 51% of his life, Elise." I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clacking in the background as she began typing. "Bring everything to my office tomorrow morning," Elise instructed. "But Ariel, we have a much bigger problem than his little Aspen vacation right now." My stomach tightened. I stood up from the bed, pacing the short distance to the window. "What do you mean?" "I have been tracking the financial chatter around Apex since you retained me last week," Elise said, her tone dropping an octave. "Donovan is moving much faster than we anticipated. He has scheduled an emergency board meeting. He is trying to push through a $100 million buyout from a Wall Street private equity firm." I gripped the phone, pressing it hard against my ear. "That is impossible," I said. "He cannot authorize a corporate sale of that magnitude without the signature of the majority shareholder. The due diligence team from Wall Street would flag my ownership immediately." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched, making the buzzing fluorescent light overhead sound deafening. Unless Elise replied softly, he presented them with a document proving you surrendered your voting rights years ago. A document you never actually signed. The air left my lungs. Forgery. Donovan was not just cheating on his marriage. He was attempting to orchestrate a staggering federal crime. If that private equity deal closed before we could stop it, he would liquidate the company assets into untraceable offshore cash. I would be left fighting a ghost in family court, while he and Kendra spent my seed money on a beach somewhere. The window to stop him was closing rapidly. I looked down at the documents spread across the motel bed. My legacy was printed on those pages. I was not going to let him steal it twice. The drive to Charlotte the following morning was a blur of interstate lines and churning thoughts. The Carolina landscape shifted from rolling green hills to the sharp glass skyline of the city's financial district. I navigated the heavy traffic with a singular focus, pulling into the underground parking garage of Elise Montgomery's high-rise building. I carried the vintage leather briefcase, feeling its familiar weight settling my nerves. Elise's corner office overlooked the sprawling metropolis, a fitting vantage point for a woman who dismantled corporate empires before lunch. She sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing the contents of my briefcase. Elise did not do small talk. She did strategy. She carefully lifted the original, unredacted incorporation charter, sliding it under a desk lamp to examine the ink. Her lips curved into a sharp, predatory smile. "This is flawless," Ariel Elise said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the document. "He truly believed you discarded this. Men who underestimate their wives are my favorite kind of clients to destroy." I sat across from her, maintaining a steady gaze. "How long will it take to file the temporary restraining order on his assets?" Elise leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her fingers. "Ordinarily less than 48 hours. But the chatter I picked up yesterday changes the timeline. We are not just racing against his divorce filings. We are racing against a massive liquidity event." She turned her monitor toward me. The screen displayed a restricted corporate registry. "Donovan has called an emergency session of the Apex Logistics Board for this Friday. He is aggressively pushing through a $100 million buyout offer from a Wall Street private equity firm. He wants to cash out entirely." I stared at the numbers on the screen. The audacity was staggering. "If that sale goes through," I said, "the capital will be dispersed into offshore accounts within hours. He will shelter the cash behind layers of shell companies before the family court judge even signs our discovery orders." "Exactly," Elise confirmed. "He is trying to render himself legally penniless on paper while sitting on a mountain of untraceable wealth. He engineered this divorce around the buyout schedule." I frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. "But a Wall Street private equity firm would never skip due diligence. Their forensic accountants are ruthless. They would demand the original charter. They would see my 51% ownership clearly written in the corporate history. How could he possibly sell a company he does not legally control?" Elise's expression hardened. She clicked open a secondary file and slid a printed document across the desk. "That is the exact question I asked my paralegal to investigate at dawn." We pulled the updated corporate filings from the Secretary of State. I picked up the paper. It was a share dilution agreement dated 4 years ago. The text claimed that I, Ariel Chavez Pierce, voluntarily surrendered my voting rights and transferred 40% of my equity into a holding company called Summit Holdings LLC, a company solely controlled by Donovan Pierce. At the bottom of the page, resting above the notary seal, was my signature. My stomach dropped, a cold, hollow sensation spreading through my chest. The ink loops were nearly perfect. The slant of the letters closely mirrored my handwriting. But the pressure was wrong. The spacing was slightly too rigid. "I never signed this," I whispered, tracing the forged signature with a shaking finger. 4 years ago, I was coordinating the twins' middle school debate tournament in Asheville. I was not even in the city on the date listed here. Elise leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "Are you absolutely certain, Ariel? Because if you are, we just crossed the line from a nasty civil divorce into a major federal crime. Forgery, wire fraud, attempted corporate embezzlement." I looked up from the document. The shock faded instantly, replaced by a sharp, burning clarity. I am certain, Elise. He forged my name to steal my company. The stakes had just escalated far beyond a simple division of assets. Donovan was actively committing felonies to erase my legacy. The 72-hour countdown had begun. If the private equity firm signed those papers on Friday, the forgery would be buried under layers of complex corporate litigation that could take a decade to untangle. I needed to stop the board meeting without tipping off Donovan that I possessed the original charter. Elise immediately began drafting a covert legal injunction, aiming to quietly stall the Wall Street lawyers. But an injunction based on a disputed signature might not hold up against an army of high-priced corporate attorneys eager to close a $100 million deal. We need concrete, irrefutable proof of his financial misconduct, Elise said, typing rapidly. A signature battle becomes a war of expert witnesses. I need a smoking gun, Ariel. I need evidence of a crime so glaring that a federal judge will freeze every single asset associated with Donovan Pierce before Friday morning. As she spoke, my phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text message from an unknown number glowed brightly. The message read, "Check the archive server logs, Project Blue Ridge. He is moving the signature deadline up to Thursday night. Tell no one." I recognized the syntax immediately. Marcus. He was a veteran IT architect at Apex Logistics, one of the few original employees I had personally hired 15 years ago. Donovan despised Marcus because he rarely attended the flashy corporate parties, preferring to stay in the server room. I had quietly doubled his salary before I stepped down, ensuring his loyalty to the company structure. Marcus was fiercely protective of the network I had built. I showed the message to Elise. Her eyes narrowed. "Thursday night," she murmured. "He knows we are circling. He is accelerating the timeline." What is Project Blue Ridge? I do not know, I admitted. But if Marcus is risking his career to send this, it is the smoking gun we need. Elise closed her laptop decisively. I will finalize the injunction and prepare the federal filings. You have less than 48 hours to find out what Project Blue Ridge is and bring me the digital proof. Do not log in from a recognizable IP address. Do not leave a trace. I left her office with the vintage briefcase, feeling the crushing weight of the ticking clock. The drive back to the motel in Durham was tense. The sky darkened, promising a heavy summer storm. I needed to access the Apex servers without triggering Donovan's security protocols. Fortunately, my husband had a fatal flaw. He understood the business of technology, but he never truly understood the machinery underneath. I had coded the original server architecture a decade ago. It was a powerful symbol of our entire relationship. I built the foundation, while he merely painted the interface. Because I knew the deep structural code, I also knew the administrative backdoors Donovan was far too arrogant to close. He assumed I was just a housewife, disconnected from the digital world for years. He vastly underestimated my memory. Back in the sterile motel room, I unpacked my laptop. I connected to a secure virtual private network, routing my signal through a series of encrypted servers across Europe. I opened a command terminal, the familiar black screen with glowing green text, bringing a rush of old adrenaline. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the superficial security layers Donovan had recently installed. I slipped into the Apex network like a ghost. I navigated past the active employee directories and the current financial databases, diving deep into the archived logs Marcus had mentioned. I searched the hidden subfolders, hunting for the elusive project name. At exactly 2 a.m, I hit a restricted firewall. The label on the digital vault read Blue Ridge Ventures. I cracked my knuckles typing in the master override sequence I had written 15 years earlier. The firewall dissolved. A massive cache of financial documents flooded my screen. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted wire transfer logs. Donovan was not just inflating his corporate valuation for the Wall Street buyers. He was systematically draining the company accounts. Blue Ridge Ventures was a sophisticated shell company designed to funnel massive amounts of untaxed corporate revenue out of Apex Logistics. But the destination of those funds was what made my blood run cold. He was not hiding the money in offshore tax havens. He was purchasing luxury beachfront real estate in the Outer Banks. Millions of dollars of premium coastal property. I clicked on the property deeds attached to the latest wire transfers. The purchaser was not Donovan Pierce. Every single beachfront mansion, every luxury condo, every prime piece of commercial shoreline was legally deeded to one person: Kendra Sloan. The betrayal was staggering. He was not just taking his mistress on a ski trip. He was funding a massive illegal real estate empire in her name, using the money I had seeded 15 years ago. The personal infidelity had just escalated into a multi-million-dollar financial crime. I had found the smoking gun, but exposing it would require navigating a dangerous minefield. Donovan was backed into a corner, and men like him were most dangerous when they realized they were losing control. The motel air conditioning unit rattled a steady, monotonous rhythm against the humid North Carolina night. I sat cross-legged on the stiff mattress with my laptop illuminating the dark room. The screen cast a pale blue light across my face, contrasting with the harsh shadows thrown by the solitary bedside lamp. I had bypassed the superficial security layers of Apex Logistics an hour ago. Now I was navigating the deep digital catacombs of the company. 15 years ago, I wrote the foundational code for this entire network. I spent sleepless nights structuring the databases, writing the routing logic, and building the secure payment gateways that made the enterprise viable. Donovan never understood the code. He only understood the sleek user interface we hired a design firm to paint over my work. It was a perfect metaphor for our marriage. I constructed the load-bearing walls, and he took credit for the expensive wallpaper. Because he only understood the surface, he never realized I left administrative backdoors permanently embedded in the root architecture. He was too proud to audit the systems his wife built, assuming his newly hired tech team had overwritten my legacy. They had not. My fingers moved across the keyboard in a fluid, rapid cadence. I bypassed the active employee directories and slipped past the encrypted financial portals used by the current accounting division. I was hunting for the anomaly Marcus had warned me about. Project Blue Ridge. I ran a terminal script searching the hidden subdirectories. Lines of code cascaded down the screen, reflecting in my eyes like falling rain. Then, a secure folder materialized. It was walled off from the main corporate ledger, locked behind a secondary biometric firewall Donovan had recently installed. He thought a fingerprint scanner would keep his secrets safe. He forgot that physical scanners still relied on digital validation protocols I had authored. I typed a bypass command, overriding the hardware requirement and feeding the system a false positive authentication. The folder unlocked with a soft chime from my speakers. A cache of financial spreadsheets and scanned legal documents flooded my screen. I clicked the top file. It was a certificate of incorporation for a subsidiary shell company named Blue Ridge Ventures. The registered address was a post office box in Delaware. The listed chief executive officer was a dummy corporation tracing back to a registered agent in Nevada. I opened the attached bank ledgers. Row after row of wire transfers detailed funds flowing out of the primary Apex Logistics revenue accounts directly into Blue Ridge Ventures. These were not minor operational expenses or misplaced petty cash. They were staggering sums, logged under fictitious vendor invoices and fabricated consulting fees. Donovan was draining the lifeblood of the tech firm. He was orchestrating federal corporate embezzlement right under the noses of his board of directors and the pending Wall Street buyers. I traced the outflow, tracking the routing numbers to see where the stolen capital was going. I clicked open a subfolder labeled Acquisitions. My breath caught in my throat. The documents were real estate deeds and title transfers. Donovan was not hiding the stolen cash in offshore bank accounts or mutual funds. He was buying luxury coastal property in the Outer Banks. I stared at high-resolution appraisal photos of a sprawling oceanfront mansion in Corolla, a sleek modern penthouse in Duck, and a private commercial marina in Nag's Head. My eyes darted to the grantee line on the title deeds, expecting to see his name or the name of the shell company. Instead, a different name stared back at me, printed in crisp black ink. Kendra Sloan. He was building a coastal real estate empire and putting the deeds solely in the name of his 28-year-old mistress. He was using the seed money I gave him, the company I built from nothing, to turn her into a multi-millionaire while simultaneously trying to evict me from my home with zero assets. The scale of the betrayal transcended a simple marital affair. This was a calculated financial execution designed to leave me destitute. I scrolled further down the ledger, tracking the dates of the wire transfers to establish a timeline. My finger froze on the trackpad. A specific transaction highlighted in yellow caught my attention. A transfer of $200,000 routed to a luxury furniture importer based in Miami. I looked at the digital timestamp. October 14th. The date struck me like a physical blow. It was the twins' 14th birthday. A vivid memory rushed into my mind, pushing away the glow of the computer screen. Last October, I had contracted a severe strain of influenza that progressed into pneumonia. I spent 4 days in the telemetry wing of Duke University Hospital, struggling to draw a full breath. On the morning of Leo and Mia turning 14, I was tethered to an oxygen monitor, feeling intense guilt that I could not bake their traditional birthday cake or decorate the dining room. Donovan had visited my hospital room for exactly 10 minutes. He checked his luxury watch twice, patted my hand, and told me he had to return to the office to finalize a critical logistics contract. He promised he would take the kids out for a modest dinner to make up for my absence. I had thanked him, calling him a wonderful, devoted father, with tears in my eyes. Now the ledger revealed the crushing truth. While I was lying in a hospital bed attached to an intravenous drip, missing my children blow out their candles, Donovan was not saving the company. He was authorizing a $200,000 wire transfer to furnish Kendra's oceanfront mansion. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. The betrayal cut deeper than the stolen money. It was the casual cruelty, the sheer lack of humanity. He had weaponized my illness, using my hospitalization as a convenient alibi to enrich the woman replacing me. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, ragged breath. The sorrow inside me crystallized, turning from a chaotic storm into a cold, precise weapon. I did not want to just divorce Donovan Pierce. I wanted to dismantle him, piece by piece. I picked up my phone and dialed Elise. She answered with her usual crisp efficiency, her voice cutting through the silence of the room. "I found it," I said, my voice devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "Blue Ridge Ventures. It is a shell company. He is embezzling apex corporate funds to buy luxury real estate in the Outer Banks. And Elise, he is deeding every single property to Kendra Sloan." I heard the faint scratch of a pen against a legal pad on her end. "Corporate fraud," she murmured. "Embezzlement. Money laundering. This just became a federal issue, Ariel. How much capital has he moved through this entity? Based on these ledgers, over $8 million in the last 14 months, I replied. I have the wire timestamps, the fake vendor invoices, and the property deeds. I can send the encrypted files to your secure server right now. Elise took a sharp breath. Do it. But Ariel, listen to me very carefully. You must maintain utter silence. You cannot confront him. You cannot text him. You cannot let slip to anyone that we hold these documents. Why? I asked. We have the proof to stop the Wall Street buyout right now. We can freeze his accounts today, because if he knows we have the server logs, he will wipe the network. Elise explained, her tone urgent. He will claim the downloaded documents are fabricated by a bitter spouse and use his board influence to bury the internal audit. We need to let him walk blindly into a trap. We need him to swear under oath on the legal record that his financial disclosures are accurate and that he holds no hidden assets. Once he commits perjury in front of a court reporter, the federal hammer falls and he will have zero room to maneuver. We let him lie first. I stared at the motel wall, absorbing her strategy. Let him lie. Let him build his own gallows. I understand, I said. I will not say a word. Good, Elise replied. He is going to realize you are not signing his initial lowball settlement offer. Men like Donovan panic when their targets do not fold immediately. He will escalate. He will try to pressure you, force your hand, or ruin your reputation to make you desperate enough to settle. Brace yourself, Ariel. The psychological warfare is about to begin. Let him try, I whispered, before ending the call. I closed my laptop and listened to the steady hum of the air conditioning. Elise was right. Donovan expected me to be a terrified, abandoned housewife begging for a fraction of his wealth. When my lawyer formally rejected his meager $500,000 settlement the following morning, his arrogance would curdle into rage. He would unleash a campaign to isolate me, assuming I was too weak to fight back. He would attempt to turn our friends, our community, and perhaps even our children against me to force a surrender. But he was operating on a fatal misconception. He thought he was playing a game of intimidation against a dependent spouse. He did not realize he was playing against the architect who engineered the board. I lay down on the stiff motel pillows, staring up at the dark ceiling, ready for his next move. By Tuesday morning, my refusal to sign the initial $500,000 settlement offer reached Donovan's legal team. I knew the exact moment he received the news because the psychological warfare commenced before noon. I had anticipated a furious phone call or an aggressive email from his attorney. I underestimated his preference for public execution. Donovan was a master of the corporate smear campaign. When a competitor threatened his market share, he did not just beat them on price, he dismantled their reputation. Now he was applying those same ruthless tactics to the woman who built his foundation. The first casualty was the Raleigh Pediatric Hospital Gala. I had founded the annual event 10 years ago, raising millions for the neonatal intensive care unit. I served as the board chairwoman, pouring my heart into the cause. At 1:15 in the afternoon, my phone chimed with an email from the hospital administration. The subject line read, "Urgent Board Reorganization." The body of the email was clinically polite, but devastatingly clear. Due to recent concerning information brought to the attention of the executive committee, they were requesting my immediate resignation. They cited the need for the board to remain above reproach, thanking me for my past service. I sat on the edge of the motel bed staring at the screen. Concerning information. 10 minutes later, my closest friend in the charity circle forwarded me an email she had received from Donovan. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. He had attached a medical invoice from 12 years ago when I sought treatment for severe postpartum anxiety after the twins were born. It was a terrifying period in my life, but I had navigated it with therapy and a mild temporary prescription. Donovan had redacted the dates and twisted the context, drafting a deeply sympathetic email to our social circle. He claimed his heart was broken, but he could no longer hide my severe substance abuse issues. He painted a tragic portrait of a husband who had tried everything to save his wife, but was finally forced to intervene for the safety of the company. It was a brilliant lie. In the high society circles of the Research Triangle, scandal was toxic, but mental health crises framed as addiction were social suicide. The country club mothers who used to text me for tennis matches suddenly stopped replying. My inbox filled with passive-aggressive messages offering prayers and asking for space. I was uninvited, exiled, and erased from the community I had spent a decade nurturing. He wanted me isolated. He believed that if he cut off my social support system, I would crumble and accept whatever crumbs he tossed my way just to make the public humiliation stop. I closed my laptop, the metallic snap echoing in the quiet motel room. The urge to fire back, to post the truth online, to call every board member and scream my defense was nearly overwhelming. But I remembered Elisa's warning. Premature defense looks like guilt. If I reacted, he controlled the narrative. If I stayed silent, he would grow increasingly confident in his own fabricated reality. I needed him arrogant. I needed him rushing headlong toward Friday without looking closely at the legal landmines Elise was burying. I needed to feed his ego. I opened a new email draft, creating a temporary account routed through an encrypted server. I spent 20 minutes crafting a message designed specifically for Bridget's eyes. I knew Donovan's sister checked the shared family cloud accounts, searching for gossip she could weaponize. The draft was addressed to a fictitious public defender's office in Wake County. The tone was desperate, panicked, and pathetic. I wrote that I was completely broke, that Donovan had frozen every cent, and that I urgently needed pro bono legal representation because I could not afford to fight him in court. I added a tearful plea, asking if they handled cases where a wife was being unfairly evicted. I saved the draft to the shared family cloud, knowing Bridget would find it within the hour. It was a classic red herring, a piece of bait so perfectly suited to their prejudice that they would swallow it whole. I needed to buy groceries. The motel kitchenette was empty, and the adrenaline crash was making my hands shake. I drove to an upscale supermarket in Cary, a place I frequented when I lived in the estate. I pulled a shopping cart through the aisles, selecting simple, generic brands. A strange new reality replacing the imported cheeses and organic produce I usually bought. As I approached the checkout lanes, I heard the familiar sharp click of expensive heels. Bridget. She spotted me instantly. Her eyes swept over my casual clothes, the cheap motel keycard sticking out of my purse, and the generic items in my cart. A triumphant smirk spread across her face. She practically vibrated with the thrill of having an audience. "Ariel!" she called out, her voice carrying over the beep of the scanners. "Shopping for yourself now? How quaint." I placed a loaf of bread on the conveyor belt, keeping my expression neutral. "Hello, Bridget." She stepped closer, ensuring the woman bagging groceries and the teenage cashier heard every word. "Donovan told me about the hospital board. It is really for the best, Ariel. You need to focus on getting clean, though I suppose it is hard to afford rehab when you are begging for public defenders online." She had found the email. The bait was set. I pulled my wallet from my purse, retrieving a modest amount of cash. "Make sure Donovan keeps all his receipts, Bridget," I said softly. She laughed a harsh, grating sound. "You are delusional, Ariel. You have nothing. You are nothing without him. Enjoy the cheap bread." She turned and marched out of the store, radiating victory. I finished paying. The teenage cashier, a boy with acne and tired eyes, handed me my receipt. He did not say a word, but he looked at me with a profound, quiet sympathy. He had witnessed the cruelty and recognized the injustice without knowing a single detail. I offered him a small, genuine smile and took my bags. Back in my car, my phone buzzed. It was Elise. He took the bait, she said, her voice crackling with electricity. Donovan's lawyer just filed an expedited discovery motion. They are trying to rush the asset division hearing before Friday, pushing it to tomorrow morning. I started the engine, the low rumble steadying my nerves. Why tomorrow? Because he thinks you are unrepresented and broke, Elise explained. He submitted his financial disclosures an hour ago. He rushed the paperwork, assuming you would not have the resources to challenge it. I pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the highway. Did he include the forged share dilution agreement? Yes, Elise confirmed. He officially entered it into the court record as evidence of his sole ownership. He also claimed under oath that his total liquid assets are less than $2 million, completely omitting the Blue Ridge Ventures shell company and the real estate in the Outer Banks. He committed perjury on paper, I murmured, the realization settling like ice in my veins. He hung himself, Ariel, Elise said. He was so eager to crush you before the Wall Street deal closed that he filed fraudulent financial disclosures with a sitting family court judge. The trap was primed. Donovan believed he had successfully destroyed my reputation, exiled me from our social circle, and cornered me into a desperate surrender. He believed he was walking into a courtroom tomorrow to finalize a decisive, flawless victory over a broken woman. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. The following afternoon, my phone vibrated against the cheap laminate of the motel nightstand. The screen displayed a restricted number. I answered cautiously, fully expecting another maneuver from Donovan's legal team. Instead, a familiar, hesitant voice broke through the static. Mom. It was Mia. Her voice trembled, carrying the distinct, fragile cadence of a 14-year-old girl trying desperately not to cry. Mia, sweetheart, I said, sitting up straight, the maternal instinct instantly overriding my exhaustion. Where are you? Are you okay? I am in the stairwell behind the debate hall, she whispered. Leo is standing guard. Mom, what is happening? Dad showed up today, unannounced, and he brought her. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Donovan had taken Kendra to Asheville. He was parading his 28-year-old mistress in front of our teenage children at their boarding school. The sheer audacity of his strategy was staggering. He had locked me out of the house, frozen the accounts, and smeared my reputation in Raleigh. Now he was launching a direct assault on the only thing I truly valued. He wanted to buy the loyalty of my children before Friday morning, ensuring he had total emotional leverage. Take a deep breath, Mia, I said, keeping my tone perfectly calm, anchoring her with my stability. Tell me exactly what happened. He checked us out for an early dinner, she explained, her words spilling out in a hurried, anxious rush. He drove up in a brand new sports car. He tossed Leo the keys and told him it would be waiting in the driveway when he got his license next year. He kept acting like everything was a massive celebration, like we won the lottery, a luxury car. Donovan was attempting to bribe a 14-year-old boy with a European engine. It was a classic transactional maneuver, treating his own son like a hesitant board member he needed to secure. And Kendra? I asked, bracing myself for the impact. Mia let out a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh. Mom, it was horrible. She sat next to Leo and kept touching his shoulder. She wore this ridiculous leather jacket and kept trying to use slang that was popular 3 years ago. She actually called our debate tournament a total vibe. It was completely cringeworthy. She is trying so hard to act like our cool new mom, but she just looks like an intern. I felt a sharp, protective surge of anger. Kendra Sloan had no idea how to navigate the complex emotional landscape of teenagers. She was a corporate climber out of her depth, trying to play house with children who were practically her peers a decade ago. Did your father say anything about me? I asked, knowing the answer before she spoke. Mia fell silent for a heavy moment. He said you were very sick, Mom. He told us you needed professional help, and that is why you were not answering our calls. He claimed you were bitter about the company because you never understood the tech industry. He said he built everything himself to give us a good life and that you were trying to ruin it out of jealousy. He was actively rewriting history, painting himself as the sole martyr and dismissing my entire career. I remembered long nights rocking Mia to sleep while simultaneously reviewing lines of code on a glowing monitor. I remembered balancing Leo on my hip while finalizing the initial venture capital pitch decks that saved Donovan from ruin. Now my husband was sitting in a high-end Asheville restaurant, erasing my legacy in front of the very children I sacrificed it for. The urge to scream the truth was agonizing. I wanted to tell Mia about the forged signature, the empty bank accounts, the multi-million-dollar shell company, the real estate in the Outer Banks. I wanted to tear Donovan's fabricated narrative to shreds and expose him as a common thief. But I stopped myself. Children deeply resent being weaponized in a divorce. If I dragged my daughter into the mud of financial discovery, if I demanded she choose sides, I would be no better than Donovan. I had to protect their innocence, even if it meant letting him play the hero for a few more days. I had to secure their respect through integrity, not manipulation. Mia, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. Listen to me very carefully. I am not sick. I am not broken. I am completely safe, and I am fighting for our family. Then why did Dad say those things? She asked, her voice cracking. Why did he bring her? Because your father is very frightened right now, I replied, choosing my words with surgical precision. People say desperate things when they realize they are losing control of the story. I am not going to speak poorly of him, Mia. He is your father, and you have a right to love him. But I want you and Leo to remember one thing. Actions always speak louder than expensive cars. There was a pause on the line. I heard the faint echo of a heavy door opening in the background. Mom, Mia whispered, her tone shifting from tearful to conspiratorial. Leo did not take the keys. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Mia let out a shaky breath. Dad was talking about how he founded Apex Logistics entirely by himself in the garage 15 years ago. He was bragging to Kendra about how he secured the first major servers, but Leo stopped eating. He looked right at Dad and asked how he afforded enterprise-grade servers when the public bankruptcy records show his first company failed exactly 15 years ago. A fierce, swelling pride expanded in my chest. Leo, my brilliant, analytical boy. He possessed my mind, a mind trained to locate discrepancies in logic. Donovan had spun a superficial lie, forgetting that he raised a son who competed in national debate tournaments. Leo did not just accept the narrative, he cross-examined it. Dad got really red in the face, Mia continued. He stumbled over his words and said he found a silent investor. Then Leo asked why a silent investor would give a bankrupt guy $1 million without taking majority equity. Kendra looked really confused, and Dad just told Leo to stop being disrespectful. Leo put the car keys down on the table and asked to go back to the dorm. Donovan's flashy bribery had actively backfired. He assumed teenagers were easily blinded by material wealth, failing to recognize their intellectual depth. He tried to buy their loyalty, and instead, inadvertently proved my point. You tell your brother I am incredibly proud of him, I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time in days. And Mia, I want you to focus on your tournament this weekend. Do not worry about the house. Do not worry about Kendra. Just watch how the truth unfolds. I will, Mom, she said, her voice finally sounding steady and grounded. "We miss you. I miss you both. I will see you very soon." I ended the call leaning back against the headboard of the motel bed. The fierce battle for the hearts and minds of my children was over. Donovan had deployed his heaviest emotional artillery, and it had detonated in his own face. By refusing to stoop to his level by maintaining the high road, I had secured the absolute loyalty of my twins. They saw the desperation behind his grand gestures. They recognized the hollow nature of his promises. Donovan was now entirely isolated. He had alienated his children. He had committed perjury in family court. He was accelerating a fraudulent corporate buyout. And he was completely oblivious to the fact that his supposedly destitute wife was currently holding the detonator to his entire existence. My phone buzzed again, pulling my attention back to the screen. It was Elise. "We are confirmed," she stated, her voice sharp and eager. "The emergency discovery deposition is set for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in my Charlotte office. Donovan's lawyer just sent over the final list of attendees." "Who is coming?" I asked, swinging my legs off the bed. "Donovan, his lead counsel, and his newly appointed corporate liaison." Elise paused for dramatic effect. "Kendra Sloan. They are bringing her to the deposition, Ariel. He is practically parading his arrogance." A cold, satisfied thrill coursed through my veins. He was bringing his mistress to a sworn legal proceeding, believing he was about to secure an effortless victory over a defeated woman. He had no idea the room he was walking into tomorrow was not a negotiation table. It was a perfectly constructed trap. The morning sun reflected sharply off the glass facade of the Charlotte high-rise as I stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor. The reception area of Elise Montgomery's law firm was a testament to cold, calculated success, featuring minimalist leather furniture and sweeping panoramic views of the financial district. I held my posture rigid, gripping the handle of the vintage briefcase tightly. Before I could reach the front desk, my eyes landed on a figure seated near the windows. Kendra Sloan. She sat with her legs crossed, reading a glossy magazine. She wore a tailored white blazer over a silk camisole, clearly aiming for the look of a seasoned corporate partner rather than a junior executive playing house. Donovan had brought her here. It was a brazen tactical maneuver designed to throw me off balance. He wanted me to walk into the deposition feeling replaced, inferior, and distracted by the woman currently sleeping in my bed. Kendra lowered her magazine as I approached. She offered a tight, practiced smile, a gesture lacking any genuine warmth. It was the expression of a winner surveying the defeated opposition. I did not break my stride. I did not glare or offer a sarcastic greeting. I looked right through her, as if she were a piece of generic lobby furniture, and walked directly into the main conference room. Her smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Silence is a weapon that narcissists never know how to combat. The conference room was vast and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the long, rectangular mahogany table in harsh morning sunlight. Elise was already seated, unpacking thick manila folders and arranging her legal pads with surgical precision. A certified court reporter sat quietly in the corner, adjusting the keys on a small stenography machine. I placed the vintage leather briefcase, the one holding the unredacted corporate charter and the 15 years of pristine pay stubs, securely on the floor right beside my chair. 2 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open. Donovan strolled into the room, projecting the aura of a reigning monarch entering a conquered territory. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his gold watch catching the sunlight as he adjusted his cuffs. His lead counsel, a silver-haired man with an expensive tan, trailed closely behind him, carrying a remarkably thin leather portfolio. Donovan took a seat across from me. He leaned back, resting his forearms on the table, and offered me a look of profound, patronizing pity. He truly believed I was arriving today with nothing but a desperate plea for spousal support. He thought the fabricated email I leaked about needing a public defender was the reality of my situation. He assumed Elise was merely a consultation I could barely afford. The dramatic irony saturating the room was almost intoxicating. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the polished wood, keeping my expression a mask of polite boredom. I knew exactly what resided in the digital catacombs of the Apex Logistics servers. I knew about Blue Ridge Ventures. I knew about the forged signature. And Donovan was about to swear on the federal record that none of it existed. The court reporter asked Donovan to raise his right hand. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He lowered his hand with a smug, confident sigh. Elise clicked her gold fountain pen. The interrogation began. She started with the mundane details, establishing his name, his residence, and his formal title as the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Logistics. Donovan answered with crisp, practiced authority. His attorney sat beside him, looking entirely relaxed, assuming this would be a brief, effortless procedure. "Let us discuss the founding of the corporate entity, Elise," said her voice smooth and conversational. "Mr. Pierce, you claim in your financial disclosures that Apex Logistics is entirely premarital property and that you are the sole visionary behind the platform. Is that correct?" "Yes," Donovan replied, flashing a charming smile. "I conceptualized the routing software in a rented garage long before we were married. I built the infrastructure from the ground up." I watched his face as he spun the fabricated narrative. He spoke of sleepless nights coding the original architecture and struggling to secure server space. He stole my memories and painted himself as the protagonist. I remembered the harsh glare of my dual monitors while I wrote the routing logic he was currently taking credit for. I remembered him sleeping soundly in the next room while I debugged the payment gateways that eventually made him a multimillionaire. "And your wife Elise asked, gesturing toward me with her pen, what was her role during this crucial startup phase? Did she contribute to the coding, the infrastructure, or the business development?" Donovan let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "Ariel, no. My wife does not possess a technical background. She managed the household while I built the empire. She provided emotional support, certainly, but she never involved herself in the corporate operations. To be perfectly honest, she never worked a day in her life." The stenography machine clicked rapidly, capturing the lie forever. I did not flinch. I let him weave his own noose. Elise turned a page on her legal pad. "Fascinating," she murmured. "Let us move to the initial seed capital. Launching an enterprise of this magnitude requires substantial funding. How did you secure the initial $1.5 million required to keep the servers operational during your first year?" Donovan did not hesitate. "I secured a private loan from an independent angel investor, an investor who wished to remain anonymous. I paid the loan back with interest once the company became profitable." "Are you certain your wife did not provide those funds?" Elise pressed her tone, remaining remarkably neutral. Donovan rolled his eyes, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Ariel has never had access to that kind of capital. She was a dependent spouse from the day we met." His attorney nodded along, blindly trusting the narrative his client had spun. Elise flipped another page. "Let us discuss your current assets, Mr. Pierce. You filed an expedited discovery motion yesterday. In those documents, you claim your total liquid assets amount to roughly $2 million. Furthermore, you claim to own zero real estate outside of the Carey estate, which is currently under dispute." "That is correct," Donovan stated, his chin lifting. "You hold no hidden subsidiary accounts?" Elise asked, her eyes locking onto his. "You possess no offshore trusts. You operate no secondary shell companies designed to hold corporate revenue. I am a transparent businessman," Donovan replied, his tone dripping with self-righteous indignation. Every single dollar I own is listed in that disclosure packet. Elise fell silent. The conference room grew incredibly quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant, muffled sirens of the city streets far below. She picked up her gold fountain pen. She held it over her yellow legal pad. The 3 sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the tense atmosphere. Elise leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. Her gaze sharpened, transforming from conversational to lethal. "Are you absolutely certain, Mr. Pierce?" Donovan let out a short, arrogant laugh. He leaned back in his expensive chair, crossing his arms over his tailored chest. He looked at Elise, then he looked directly into my eyes, delivering his final sealing blow. "Absolutely." The word hung in the air, sealed by the court reporter. The trap was officially sprung. He had just committed felony perjury regarding both his historical corporate filings and his current financial disclosures. He lied about the seed capital. He lied about the foundational labor. He lied about the forged share dilution. He lied about Blue Ridge Ventures. I looked at my husband, and for the first time since the charity gala, I allowed a genuine smile to touch my lips. It was a small, chilling expression of pure satisfaction. Donovan caught the shift in my demeanor. His arrogant posture faltered for a fraction of a second. A shadow of doubt crossed his features as he tried to decipher why the destitute woman sitting across from him suddenly looked like the most powerful person in the room. Elise closed her legal pad with a decisive snap. "I believe we have everything we need for today," she announced, standing up from her chair. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen." Donovan's attorney looked confused. "We have the room booked for another 3 hours," he protested. "Do you not have any further questions regarding the division of the residential property?" "That will not be necessary," Elise replied, sliding her files into her briefcase. "The residential property is the least of your client's concerns right now." She turned and walked toward the door. I picked up the heavy vintage leather briefcase from the floor and followed her. Donovan stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The unease he felt was rapidly morphing into defensive anger. He did not like being dismissed. He did not like the sudden shift in the power dynamic. He needed to reassert control to prove he was still the architect of my ruin. "Ariel!" he called out, his voice echoing off the glass walls. I stopped near the door, turning slowly to face him. "Tell your lawyer to send over the signed settlement by tomorrow morning," Donovan ordered, his tone turning harsh and demanding. "If you drag this out into a prolonged litigation, I will ensure you end up with nothing. I want a word with you before you leave. Meet me in the parking garage. Alone." His attorney shot him a warning glance, but Donovan ignored it. He was operating on pure, unchecked ego. I looked at the man I had loved, supported, and enriched for 15 years. He was demanding a private confrontation in the concrete shadows of the parking garage, intending to use physical intimidation to force my signature. He believed a raised voice and a looming presence would break my resolve. "I will see you downstairs, Donovan," I said, my voice smooth and unafraid. I stepped out of the conference room, leaving him to steep in his mounting paranoia. The deposition was over, but the true confrontation, the moment the raw power dynamic would permanently shatter, was waiting in the darkness of the lower levels. I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase, ready to face the monster I helped create. The descent from the 42nd floor felt like a transition between 2 different worlds. The glass elevator hummed a low, steady note as it dropped, leaving behind the sunlit heights of corporate warfare and sinking into the subterranean concrete belly of the building. Elise stepped off at the main lobby, offering a brief, curt nod. She had motions to file and federal judges to contact. I remained in the steel box, descending 3 more levels to the private parking structure. The doors parted, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit expanse. The air down here was heavy, thick with the metallic scent of exhaust and damp stone. Rows of high-end luxury vehicles sat parked in the shadows, reflecting the sparse fluorescent tubes buzzing overhead. I walked toward my modest rental car, the vintage leather briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. The brass latches dug slightly into my palm, a physical reminder of the power I carried. I did not unlock my car. I stood beside the driver's side door and waited. The heavy metal fire door at the far end of the garage swung open. The sound slammed against the concrete walls, echoing like a physical blow. Donovan stepped into the dim light. He had left his lead counsel upstairs. This was not a legal maneuver. This was an exercise in primal intimidation. He walked toward me with a predatory stride. The sharp, rhythmic echo of his expensive Italian leather shoes striking the pavement filled the empty space. Step, step, step. The sound bounced off the low ceiling designed to make him seem larger, more imposing than he actually was. I remembered a time when that sound would have made my pulse race with anxiety. I used to scramble to ensure dinner was perfect, the house was quiet, and the twins were doing their homework whenever I heard those footsteps approaching our front door. Now the sound just felt hollow. Donovan stopped a few feet away. He did not maintain a professional distance. He stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space, aiming to use his physical height to cast a shadow over me. The bespoke navy suit that looked so sharp in the boardroom now just looked like armor he wore to hide his own profound insecurities. "You think you are clever, Ariel," he began, his voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper. "You think hiring a high-priced shark like Montgomery is going to save you." I remained silent, maintaining a steady, even breathing pattern. My lack of reaction only fueled his frustration. "My Wall Street buyers are experiencing sudden, inexplicable delays," he continued, leaning closer. "The private equity firm is demanding secondary audits they never asked for. Yesterday. I know your lawyer filed something. I know you are trying to stall the buyout. You are playing a very dangerous game attempting to interfere with my corporate affairs." His face was inches from mine. I could smell the sharp tang of his expensive cologne mixed with the faint, sour scent of nervous perspiration. He was projecting supreme confidence, but his body betrayed him. The subtle tightening of his jaw, the rapid blink rate, his need to confront me in a parking garage instead of a well-lit office, all pointed to a man losing his grip on a carefully orchestrated reality. "If you do not call off your attack dogs and sign the settlement by tomorrow morning, I will bury you," Donovan snarled. "I will instruct my legal team to file motion after motion. We will drag this divorce out for 5 years. I will bleed you dry in court fees until you cannot even afford the rent on whatever cheap motel you are hiding in." He began to pace slowly around me. The sharp, intimidating echo of his shoes returned, circling me like a predator assessing wounded prey. I did not turn my head to track his movements. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking cornered. "I control the board of directors." Ariel, his voice floated from behind my right shoulder. "I control the banking relationships. I control the equity. You have nothing but a bitter grievance and a dwindling checking account. By the time I am finished with you, no firm in the research triangle will ever hire you. You will end up pouring coffee in a roadside diner just to pay off your legal debt." He believed his control was absolute. He thought holding the chief executive title meant he held the actual power. He forgot that the board of directors answered to the shareholders, and the banks answered to the federal regulators. He was playing a game of intimidation while I was holding the deed to his entire existence. He stopped pacing, planting himself directly in front of me again. He wanted me to look up at him with wide, terrified eyes. He wanted me to beg for the $500,000 scraps he offered. He needed to break my spirit, to ensure I would quietly fade into the background while he moved Kendra into my home and sold my legacy to Wall Street. I looked down at the concrete floor. I studied the polished toe of his imported leather shoes. Then I slowly raised my chin and looked him dead in the eye. The silence stretched between us, taut and dangerous. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or trade insults. I delivered my response with the cold, tranquil precision of a surgeon making a final incision. You always were incredibly bad at math, Donovan. The whisper hung in the damp garage air. It was a simple sentence, devoid of any explicit threats, but it struck him with the force of a physical impact. He expected tears. He expected trembling. He expected me to cave under the sheer weight of his financial superiority. Instead, he found a woman looking at him with chilling, unshakable confidence. His eyes searched mine, scanning for a bluff. He found none. The unwavering certainty in my posture, the relaxed grip of my hand on the vintage briefcase, the total absence of fear in my gaze, all contradicted the narrative he had built. He suddenly realized he was standing in the dark with a woman he did not recognize. I turned my back to him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. I pressed the button on my keys. The rental car chirped, unlocking the doors. I opened the passenger side and placed the heavy leather briefcase gently onto the seat, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Donovan did not say another word. The script he had prepared ended with my submission. Without it, he was left standing in the silent garage, empty-handed and disoriented. An inexplicable knot of panic began to tighten in his chest, taking the space where his arrogance used to live. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space, my headlights swept across his figure. He looked small. The bespoke suit, the expensive watch, the polished shoes could no longer disguise the fundamental truth. He was a fraud, terrified of being exposed. I drove up the concrete ramp, emerging back into the bright Carolina sunshine. The pre-trial intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. Instead of securing my surrender, Donovan had inadvertently confirmed his own desperation. His threats about the stalling private equity deal told me Elise's silent injunctions were already wrapping around his throat. The board of directors he claimed to control was about to receive a devastating awakening. The drive back to Durham gave me time to prepare for the final stage. The psychological warfare had reached its peak. Donovan had exhausted his social smears, his attempts to manipulate our teenagers, and his physical intimidation. He had nothing left, but the fabricated financial disclosures he had sworn under oath were authentic. Tomorrow morning, we would enter the Wake County Courthouse for the crucial asset division hearing. Donovan believed he was walking in to secure a swift, unceremonious eviction, formally stripping me of my rights and my dignity in front of a family court judge. He believed his redacted tax returns and his false testimony would seal my fate. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, a quiet resolve settling deep in my bones. Tomorrow, the hidden foundation of Apex Logistics would finally be dragged into the light. The 15 years of silent labor, the seed capital, the forged signature, and the multi-million-dollar betrayal would all converge on a single, polished courtroom table. The war was moving from the shadows into the official judicial record, and I was ready to let the truth destroy him. The morning sun hit the granite steps of the Wake County Courthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I walked through the towering entry columns, feeling the cool, polished marble floors beneath my shoes. The air inside the building carried a distinct metallic scent, mixed with floor wax and old paper. It was the smell of consequence. Every person moving through these corridors carried the weight of a fractured life, but my steps felt remarkably light. The fear that Donovan had tried to instill in me yesterday had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, precise clarity. Elise walked beside me, her heels clicking in perfect unison with mine. She carried nothing but a slim notepad. I carried the vintage leather briefcase. We did not speak as we boarded the crowded elevator ascending to the 4th floor. There was no need for final strategies or last-minute pep talks. The trap was already set. We only needed to wait for the prey to step onto the trigger. We pushed through the heavy oak double doors of Department 4. The courtroom was a solemn, cavernous space paneled in dark wood and illuminated by stark, recessed lighting. Rows of solid wooden benches filled the gallery, separated from the legal tables by a low, swinging gate. I took my seat at the plaintiff table, resting my hands in the smooth surface. I placed the vintage briefcase gently on the floor, right beside Elise's chair. A moment later, the doors swung open again. Donovan strode down the center aisle. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked tailored to a fraction of a millimeter. His silver-haired lead counsel walked a half step ahead, holding a thick stack of manila folders. Donovan offered a polite, charming nod to the bailiff, projecting the image of a reasonable, cooperative citizen who was merely trying to resolve an unfortunate domestic dispute. He took his seat at the defense table. He did not look at me. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, displaying a practiced stoicism. The wooden benches in the gallery groaned. I did not need to turn around to know who had just arrived. The overwhelming scent of sweet floral perfume drifted over the partition, settling into the sterile courtroom air. Kendra Sloan took a seat in the second row, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Bridget. I kept my eyes forward, but I could hear the distinct sound of their whispering. Kendra shifted her weight, her expensive jewelry clinking against the wooden pew. Bridget let out a low, snide laugh that she barely bothered to muffle. They were treating this judicial proceeding like a spectator sport, arriving to watch my public execution from the front row. Kendra sat proudly, her posture radiating unearned victory. She believed she was hours away from legally inheriting the empire I had ceded. Bridget whispered another comment, leaning close to Kendra, displaying a unified front of petty hostility. The heavy door behind the bench opened, and the bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Higgins stepped up to the elevated desk. He was a veteran of the family court system, a man with thinning white hair, a stern jawline, and the weary demeanor of someone who had spent decades listening to spouses tear each other apart over kitchen appliances and bank accounts. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the sprawling piles of legal filings spread across his desk. "Let us begin," Judge Higgins said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant authority. "We are here for the preliminary asset division and temporary support hearing regarding Pierce versus Pierce." He shuffled a stack of papers, peering over his thick lenses. He looked at Donovan's attorney. "Counsel, the floor is yours. Walk me through your primary motion." The silver-haired attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked toward the center podium, carrying a specific practiced gravitas. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, his tone echoing with practiced sincerity. "My client, Mr. Pierce, comes before this court today with a heavy heart. He has spent the last 15 years providing an exceptionally comfortable life for his wife, single-handedly carrying the financial burdens of their household. He built his company, Apex Logistics, from a conceptual idea in a rented garage into a regional success. He did this through grueling labor, sleepless nights, and sole financial risk." The attorney paused, letting the narrative settle over the room. "Unfortunately, Your Honor, that drive and ambition were never shared by the plaintiff. Mrs. Pierce has not held a job, generated an income, or contributed financially to this marriage in 15 years. She has enjoyed the fruits of my client's labor while avoiding the soil. She has lived a life of profound leisure, funded entirely by the man sitting beside me. I listened to my own history being rewritten on the federal record. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. The attorney was standing in a court of law, describing a lazy, dependent spouse, while the woman who actually coded the operational foundation of the tech firm sat silently 10 feet away. Furthermore, the attorney continued, lifting a document from his folder. My client is currently navigating severe operational difficulties. The logistics sector is volatile. In a gesture of supreme generosity, Mr. Pierce has offered a $500,000 settlement to ensure Mrs. Pierce transitions smoothly into her new independent life. However, the plaintiff has rejected this fair offer, demanding an equal share of a company she never worked a single day to build. Judge Higgins frowned, resting his chin on his folded hands. That is a bold claim, counsel. You are asserting that the plaintiff provided zero economic value to the marital estate. Zero, Your Honor? The attorney confirmed, without a trace of hesitation. To substantiate this, we are submitting Exhibit A, my client's official tax returns and certified corporate revenue disclosures spanning the last 5 years. The attorney handed a thick stack of stapled papers to the court clerk, who passed them up to the judge. I recognized the forms. They were the joint tax returns I used to review every spring. But the pages the lawyer had just submitted were unrecognizable. As Your Honor can see, the attorney stated, gesturing toward the bench, those documents have been redacted to protect proprietary corporate data, but the bottom line figures remain visible. Mr. Pierce holds roughly $2 million in total liquid assets. The company is carrying significant debt. Awarding the plaintiff half of the corporate equity would bankrupt the firm and destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of employees. We formally request the court deny any temporary spousal support and order the plaintiff to vacate all marital properties immediately. I watched Judge Higgins flip through the pages. The tax returns were heavily falsified. Donovan had provided his lawyer with documents showing massive fabricated liabilities, suppressing his true net worth, while entirely omitting the existence of Blue Ridge Ventures and the multi-million-dollar coastal real estate portfolio. Donovan had crossed the point of no return. He was not just lying to me anymore. He was using a licensed officer of the court to present fraudulent financial instruments to a sitting judge. He was actively committing a federal crime in broad daylight. Behind me in the gallery, Kendra let out a soft, smug sigh. Bridget whispered something else, her tone dripping with venomous satisfaction. They thought the performance was flawless. They thought the silver-haired lawyer had just delivered the final, fatal blow to my dignity. Donovan sat perfectly still, trying to maintain his stoic facade, but the subtle, proud lift of his chin betrayed his internal victory. He thought he had won. Elise did not react. She did not object or interrupt the monologue. She sat beside me, taking pristine, methodical notes on her yellow legal pad, allowing the opposition to dig their grave as deep as possible. Judge Higgins finished scanning the fraudulent tax returns. He stacked the papers neatly, aligning the edges with the desk. He let out a long, weary sigh, removing his reading glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the plaintiff table, his expression hardening into a stern, judicial glare. The claims presented by the defense are quite severe, Judge Higgins said, his gravelly voice filling the silence. The documentation provided paints a very specific picture of the financial dynamics within this marriage. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the elevated desk. He looked directly at Elise. Counsel Judge Higgins prompted, peering intently over his desk. Your client is facing immediate eviction and a total denial of asset distribution based on the assertion that she provided zero financial contribution to this estate. Do you have any rebuttal to the plaintiff's claim that Mrs. Pierce never contributed a single dollar to this marriage? The courtroom grew remarkably quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioning unit seemed to amplify in the silence. I looked at Elise. She stopped writing. She set her gold fountain pen down on the legal pad. She reached down toward the floor, wrapping her hand around the sturdy handle of the vintage leather briefcase. With a smooth, effortless motion, she lifted the briefcase and set it directly onto the polished wood of our table. She popped the twin brass latches. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the silent room like the cocking of a heavy mechanism. Elise reached inside and pulled out a single, extremely thick, worn accordion folder. The seams of the folder strained under the weight of 15 years of hidden truth. Elise placed the heavy accordion folder onto the table. The dull thud of the dense paper striking the wood resonated across the room. She stood up, buttoning her suit jacket, her eyes locking onto the judge with a lethal, unwavering calm. Elise Montgomery did not rush. She stood up, pulling her tailored jacket straight, and looked directly at the bench. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying a crisp, resonant authority that demanded the attention of every person in the room. "Not only did my client work throughout the duration of this marriage, she was the sole seed investor, the primary software engineer, and the foundational architect of Apex Logistics." A collective shift occurred in the gallery. Whispers died instantly. Donovan's attorney scoffed a short, dismissive sound, but it lacked conviction. Elise ignored him. She reached into the thick accordion folder she had pulled from the vintage leather briefcase. The worn edges of the leather bag sat on our table, a silent witness to a decade and a half of unacknowledged labor. She withdrew the first stack of documents banded together with thick rubber. "We submit into evidence Plaintiff Exhibit 1, Elise stated, handing the stack to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. 15 years of certified pay stubs and corporate tax filings from Mrs. Pierce's premarital digital marketing and tech consultancy. These records clearly demonstrate that my client was a self-made millionaire, generating a 7-figure annual income long before she ever met the defendant." I watched Donovan. The confident set of his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the paperwork landing on the judge's desk. Elise reached back into the folder. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we submit Exhibit 2, certified bank routing records and wire transfer confirmations dated exactly 15 years ago. These documents show a direct deposit of $1.5 million transferred from my client's personal portfolio into a failing startup account held by Mr. Pierce. This was the exact capital injection that saved the defendant from impending bankruptcy and provided the sole financial foundation for Apex Logistics." The sharp, heavy rustle of thick paper echoed in the vast room as Judge Higgins turned the pages. He slid his reading glasses further down his nose, his brow furrowing as he traced the numbers with his index finger. The arithmetic was undeniable. Donovan had sworn under oath that he secured an anonymous angel investor. The federal wire transfer clearly bore my name, but Elise was just warming up. She withdrew a single protective plastic sleeve holding a slightly yellowed document. "The defense claims that Apex Logistics is solely owned and operated by the defendant," Elise said, her tone dropping an octave to a lethal, glacial calm. "That claim is a fabrication. We submit Exhibit 3, the original, unredacted incorporation charter for the company, bearing the authentic signatures of both parties. It explicitly designates Ariel Chavez Pierce as the 51% majority shareholder and primary voting bloc." Donovan's silver-haired attorney shot out of his chair. "Your Honor," he protested, his voice losing its polished veneer, "my client submitted a legally binding share dilution agreement proving the plaintiff surrendered those voting rights 4 years ago. That charter is outdated." Elise turned slowly to face the opposing counsel. The share dilution agreement you submitted to this court yesterday is a forgery, counselor. The word hung in the air. Forgery. It was not a civil dispute anymore. It was an accusation of a felony. We have included time-stamped forensic location data within Exhibit 4. Elise continued, turning back to the bench. The dilution agreement is dated October 12th, 4 years ago. On that exact date, my client was 3 hours away in Asheville, coordinating a debate tournament for her children. We have credit card receipts, hotel logs, and witness affidavits proving she was nowhere near the notary who supposedly stamped that document. The defendant forged his wife's signature to illegally seize control of a corporate entity she owns. Judge Higgins stopped shuffling the papers. The courtroom became so silent I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. The judge looked down at the original yellowed charter, then picked up the fraudulent tax returns Donovan's lawyer had submitted just moments before. The initial frown on the judge's face deepened, carving harsh lines around his mouth. He looked up, locking his eyes entirely on Donovan. The glare was furious, laser-focused, and profoundly dangerous. Donovan's attorney stared at the documents on the bench. The color drained from his face, leaving his expensive tan looking sickly and gray. He was a veteran lawyer who had built a lucrative career on calculating risk. He realized in real time that his own client had handed him falsified tax returns and a forged legal contract. He had been used to present fraudulent instruments to a sitting federal judge, jeopardizing his license and his freedom. The attorney dropped back into his chair. He leaned over to Donovan and began whispering fiercely. His hands trembled as he gestured toward the bench. I could not hear the exact words, but the panic radiating from the defense table was palpable. Donovan swallowed hard, a thick, visible gulp. He was sweating. Tiny beads of moisture gathered at his hairline. The bespoke navy suit suddenly looked suffocating. Behind me in the gallery, the smug whispering had ceased entirely. Kendra sat frozen, her perfect posture collapsing into a rigid, terrified slouch. Bridget stared at her brother, her mouth slightly open, unable to process the swift decimation of the narrative she had championed. The silence from the bench was deafening. Judge Higgins took his time. He meticulously compared the signature on the fraudulent dilution agreement with the genuine signature on the original charter. He pulled a magnifying glass from his top drawer, an old-school gesture that added an unbearable weight to the ticking clock. Mr. Pierce, Judge Higgins, finally spoke, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a serrated blade. You submitted financial disclosures to this court, swearing under penalty of perjury that they were complete and accurate. You claimed your wife generated zero income. Yet I am looking at certified tax records proving she earned over $10 million in the decade before you married. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His legendary charisma, the smooth-talking charm that had secured millions in venture capital, vanished entirely. He looked like a cornered animal, and Counselor Judge Higgins turned his piercing gaze to the silver-haired attorney. You stood at that podium 5 minutes ago and asserted that your client was the sole visionary and financial backer of this enterprise. You entered a share dilution agreement into the public record. Did you personally verify the authenticity of that notary seal? The attorney stood up, his knees visibly shaking. Your Honor, he stammered, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. I relied on the representations made by my client. I had no reason to suspect the documents provided to my office were altered. You are an officer of the court, Judge Higgins warned, his tone dangerously low. Ignorance is a very thin shield when federal fraud is placed on my desk. I sat silently, absorbing the atmosphere. For 15 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had allowed Donovan to stand on stages and accept awards for the software I engineered. I had smiled politely at charity dinners while his peers praised his brilliant entrepreneurial mind. I had let him believe he was the giant and I was the shadow. Now, the shadow was swallowing him whole. The sheer volume of paper Elise had unloaded was a physical manifestation of my life. Every pay stub represented late nights coding in a cramped apartment. The wire transfer slip represented the sacrifice of my own independence to save his dream. The original charter represented the undeniable truth of our partnership. He had tried to erase my history, but ink and paper do not forget. Donovan's breathing grew shallow and rapid. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, for a shred of the quiet, supportive wife he had discarded. He wanted me to call it off. He wanted me to intervene and save him from the judicial execution he had arranged for himself. I did not offer him a single glance of pity. I maintained my cold, tranquil posture. I was no longer his safety net. I was the architect of his consequence. Elise remained standing, her posture immaculate. She was not finished. The perjury regarding the corporate charter was enough to strip him of his leverage, but it was not enough to put him behind bars. We needed to push him over the precipice. We needed to expose the shell company. We needed to introduce the real estate. Your Honor, Elise said, recapturing the attention of the room. The fraudulent suppression of my client's equity is only the beginning of the deception. Mr. Pierce did not just forge a document to steal a company. He forged it to cover his tracks while he systematically drained the corporate accounts. The silver-haired attorney practically collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He knew what was coming next. He knew his client had hidden assets. Donovan's face went from pale to a sickly shade of green. He gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white. The perjury trap had closed around his ankles, but the federal hammer was just beginning its descent. The ultimate reversal of fortune was complete, but the true depth of his depravity was still waiting in the dark digital ledgers of Project Blue Ridge. Elise Montgomery did not pause to let the opposition recover. She possessed the instinct of a seasoned predator, recognizing that a wounded target required a swift and decisive final strike. The courtroom was already suffocating under the weight of the forged corporate charter, but the true depth of the betrayal had yet to be entered into the judicial record. Your Honor, Elise said, her voice slicing through the tense silence. The fraudulent suppression of my client's equity represents merely the superficial layer of this deception. Mr. Pierce did not forge a legal document simply to stroke his own ego. He engineered that forgery to camouflage a staggering, systemic theft. She reached into the thick accordion folder one last time. She withdrew a final stack of documents secured by a heavy binder clip. The paper was crisp, stark, and undeniable. We submit. Plaintiff Exhibit 5. Elise announced, handing the stack to the bailiff. These are certified digital server logs, encrypted financial ledgers, and property deeds. They detail the operations of an entity known as Blue Ridge Ventures. Donovan stopped breathing. I watched his chest freeze. The faint color that had begun to return to his cheeks vanished, instantly draining away to leave a sickly, ashen pallor. He gripped the edge of the defense table so hard, his knuckles turned a translucent white. He thought those files were buried behind biometric firewalls. He forgot that the woman sitting 10 feet away had written the underlying code for his entire digital existence. Blue Ridge Ventures is a subsidiary shell company, Elise explained, turning her gaze toward the judge. For the past 14 months, the defendant has utilized this phantom corporation to systematically embezzle over $8 million in revenue directly from the primary accounts of Apex Logistics. He disguised these transfers as fictitious vendor invoices and fabricated consulting fees. Judge Higgins flipped open the heavy packet. His eyes scanned the highlighted ledgers, absorbing the staggering sums flowing out of the tech firm. "Where did this capital go?" Elise asked, anticipating the court's next logical question. "It did not go into offshore retirement trusts or legitimate mutual funds. The defendant utilized the stolen corporate revenue to purchase a portfolio of luxury coastal real estate in the Outer Banks, oceanfront mansions in Corolla, a modern penthouse in Duck, a private commercial marina." In the second row of the gallery, Kendra shifted. She sat up a fraction of an inch, her posture tightening. She knew about the beach houses. Donovan had likely promised her an opulent coastal lifestyle, presenting himself as a generous, wealthy benefactor. She probably believed those properties were romantic gifts purchased with legitimate wealth. She was about to receive a devastating lesson in corporate liability. "But the most compelling aspect of this real estate portfolio," Elise continued, her tone dropping to a lethal conversational hush, "is the ownership structure. Mr. Pierce did not place these properties under his own name. He did not even place them under the Apex Logistics umbrella. He deeded every single parcel of stolen land directly to the chief financial officer of the shell company." Elise turned, slowly pivoting on her heel until she was facing the gallery. She looked directly at the woman sitting in the second row, a woman named Kendra Sloan. Elise stated clearly. Kendra blinked, her perfectly manicured hands resting frozen in her lap. A faint, confused smile flickered across her lips. She thought she was being named as a beneficiary. She thought Elise was merely exposing her as the recipient of luxurious gifts. She did not understand the intricate, lethal phrasing of corporate law. Elise turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, page 42 of that exhibit contains the official articles of incorporation for Blue Ridge Ventures, filed in the state of Delaware. The defendant needed a registered officer to shield his own identity from the federal tax authorities. He designated Miss Sloan as the sole legal chief financial officer of the entity receiving the stolen funds." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Donovan had not made Kendra his partner. He had made her his shield. By appointing her as the executive officer of a fraudulent shell company, he had legally positioned her to take the fall for the embezzlement. She was no longer just the mistress in a civil divorce proceeding. She was an active, documented co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud enterprise. A loud, sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. I did not turn around, but I could envision the exact sequence of emotions shattering Kendra's carefully curated facade. The arrogant smirk, the practiced superiority, the smug certainty that she had conquered my life, all dissolved in a single, terrifying heartbeat. The luxurious beach houses were not romantic gifts. They were federal crime scenes, and her signature was on the deeds. She was legally liable for the stolen $8 million. Beside her, Bridget recoiled. The snooty, status-obsessed realtor understood the profound implications of property fraud. The alliance between the two women severed instantly. Bridget scooted her chair an inch away, creating a visible physical distance from the woman who had just been named in a federal embezzlement scheme. Judge Higgins lowered the documents. He took off his reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the elevated mahogany desk. He leaned forward, intertwining his fingers. The air in the courtroom grew dangerously still. "Mr. Pierce, the judge," said his gravelly voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. "Are you fully aware of the mandatory federal sentencing guidelines for executing perjury, forgery, and multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement?" Donovan opened his mouth. His jaw worked, but his vocal cords refused to function. He looked like a man standing on tracks, watching a freight train approach, unable to move a single muscle. He swallowed hard, attempting to summon the legendary charisma that had defined his career. It failed him entirely. Your Honor. Donovan stammered, his voice cracking, pitching upward into a pathetic, desperate whine. I can explain. The accountants handled the subsidiary filings. I was unaware of the specific tax structures. It was a cowardly, pathetic pivot. He was trying to blame his own financial team for the theft he had personally orchestrated. The silver-haired attorney sitting beside Donovan reached his breaking point. The veteran lawyer had spent the last 30 minutes watching his professional reputation disintegrate. He had been handed falsified tax returns. He had submitted a forged share dilution agreement into the public record. Now his client was attempting to lie to a furious judge about a shell company. The attorney stood up. He did not ask for permission. He did not address the bench. He grabbed his thin leather portfolio and physically took 2 wide steps away from the defense table. He put an undeniable visible distance between himself and Donovan Pierce. Your Honor, the attorney said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and self-preservation. I must immediately petition the court to withdraw as counsel for the defendant, effective this very second. I cannot, in good conscience or within the ethical boundaries of the State Bar Association, continue to represent a client who has utilized my office to submit fraudulent instruments to this court. Donovan looked up at his lawyer, his eyes wide with stark terror. The abandonment was total. His family had recoiled. His mistress was facing federal indictment. His legal representation was fleeing the room to save his own license. Judge Higgins did not argue with the attorney. I will grant your motion to withdraw counsel, the judge stated firmly, and I will be forwarding the entirety of Plaintiff Exhibit 5 alongside the forged documents to the United States Attorney's Office before the end of the business day. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He did not bang it. He simply pointed the handle directly at Donovan. You are ordered to surrender your passport to the bailiff before you leave this building, Mr. Pierce, the judge commanded. All of your personal and corporate accounts are frozen effective immediately. You are barred from accessing any property associated with the marital estate or Apex Logistics. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. The judicial execution was complete. The man who had strutted into the charity gala, radiating untouchable power, was now a cornered suspect awaiting federal indictment. He had tried to leave me penniless and humiliated. Instead, he had engineered his own total destruction. I remained seated while the gallery erupted into hushed, frantic murmurs. Elise calmly began packing her pristine legal pads back into her briefcase. The civil victory was unequivocal. But my work was not entirely finished. The Wall Street private equity firm would receive news of this disastrous court hearing within the hour. The $100 million buyout offer would vanish the moment their lawyers caught wind of the forgery and the embezzlement. The Apex Logistics Board of Directors was currently sitting in a glass-walled conference room in Raleigh, waiting for their chief executive officer to return with a clean divorce settlement. They were expecting Donovan. They were expecting a lucrative corporate sale. They had no idea that the true architect of the company, the woman who held the authentic 51% majority charter, was walking out of this courthouse and heading directly for their boardroom. The legal hammer had fallen, but the corporate reckoning was just about to begin. The news of the judicial catastrophe traveled faster than any vehicle could drive. In the financial sector, reputations evaporate in a matter of minutes. As I walked down the granite steps of the Wake County Courthouse, stepping into the blinding Carolina afternoon, my phone vibrated in my palm. The screen illuminated with a secure text message from Marcus. The Wall Street lawyers just walked out, the message read. They received a call from their due diligence team. The buyout is officially dead. The board is convening an emergency crisis session in the main conference room right now. I looked up at the pristine blue sky. The $100 million deal had collapsed. the private equity firm recognizing the toxic radioactive hazard of a chief executive officer facing federal fraud charges severed all ties. Donovan had attempted to liquidate my company into untraceable offshore cash. Instead, he had triggered a corporate implosion. Elise stood beside my car, offering a brief nod of professional respect. "The civil litigation is secured," she stated, her tone brisk and efficient. "The judge is forwarding the exhibits to the federal prosecutor. My part in this specific chapter is concluded, Ariel. The boardroom, however, is your domain. Take back your company." I thanked her, gripping the handle of the vintage leather briefcase. The drive from the courthouse to the Apex Logistics headquarters in downtown Raleigh took less than half an hour, but the journey spanned a decade and a half of silent, unacknowledged history. The company occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, modern glass tower. It was a monument to technological success, featuring panoramic views of the Research Triangle. I had not stepped foot inside that building in 4 years. I spent my time attending parent-teacher conferences and organizing pediatric charity galas, while Donovan played the visionary founder. But as I pulled my rental car into the VIP visitor parking space, I felt no hesitation. I was not a guest. I was the architect, returning to inspect her foundation. The ground floor lobby was an expanse of polished steel and white marble. A young security guard stationed behind the reception desk looked up as I approached the security turnstiles. He opened his mouth to ask for identification, but he caught the expression on my face and hesitated. I did not break my stride. I scanned a master access digital key code Marcus had discreetly routed to my phone, overriding the gate. The glass barriers parted seamlessly. I stepped into the executive elevator, pressing the button for the highest floor. The quiet hum of the ascending carriage provided a moment of solitary reflection. For 15 years, I had accepted the shadow. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace at home was more valuable than demanding recognition in the public sphere. I had allowed a mediocre man to stand on the sturdy platform I built. That era of silent submission ended the moment the elevator chimed. The steel doors opened, revealing the executive suite. The atmosphere on the floor was chaotic. Junior executives rushed down the carpeted corridors, clutching tablets and looking terrified. Administrative assistants spoke in hushed, frantic tones on their desk phones. The sudden collapse of a $100 million buyout creates a distinct, palpable panic within a corporate ecosystem. I walked straight past the reception desk. I did not announce myself. I moved with deliberate, measured precision toward the primary boardroom located at the end of the hall. The room featured floor-to-ceiling acoustic glass walls, allowing me to observe the scene before I entered. 7 members of the board of directors sat around a sprawling mahogany table. These were wealthy, seasoned venture capitalists and industry veterans. They looked furious. Some were rubbing their temples, while others stared at their phones, reading real-time updates regarding the frozen bank accounts. Sitting at the very head of the table was Donovan. He looked atrocious. The bespoke navy suit he wore to the courthouse now appeared rumpled. His silk tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned. The gray, sickly pallor had not left his face. He was leaning forward, gesturing frantically with his hands, attempting to spin the unspinnable. He was trying to convince a room full of financial fiduciaries that the frozen assets were a simple clerical error, a temporary misunderstanding in a messy divorce. I reached out and pushed the heavy glass door open. The hinges were silent, but my entrance commanded immediate attention. The frantic arguments died instantly. 7 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. Donovan froze his hands suspended in midair, his mouth hanging open. I stepped into the room. The floor beneath the expansive mahogany table was lined with rich, dark hardwood. I walked toward the head of the table. The sharp, rhythmic sound of my heels striking the wood echoed through the cavernous, silent room. Every single step was a physical manifestation of authority. I did not rush. I walked the length of the long room, maintaining unbroken eye contact with the man sitting in my chair. Donovan stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising terror. I stopped walking. My shoes came to a halt exactly 1 inch from his leather chair. I stood there looking down at him. I did not ask him to move. I did not utter a single word. I simply held my ground, projecting an aura of total, chilling ownership. The physical proximity, the sheer unwavering confidence radiating from my posture forced a silent, visceral confrontation. For 5 agonizing seconds, Donovan tried to hold my gaze. He tried to summon the arrogant, dominant husband who had cornered me in a dim parking garage just 24 hours earlier. But the man in the garage was an illusion built on stolen money and forged documents. The reality was sitting in a room full of furious investors with federal indictments looming over his head. His eyes dropped. His shoulders slumped. Defeated and utterly humiliated in front of his esteemed peers, Donovan pushed his chair back. The leather squeaked against the hard wood. He stood up, keeping his head lowered, and took 3 steps away from the head of the table. I stepped forward and took my seat. I placed the vintage leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany. The twin brass latches clicked, echoing in the quiet boardroom. I opened the lid and extracted a thick stack of pristine copies. I slid them down the table, allowing the board members to distribute the paperwork among themselves. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth, clear, and carrying the unmistakable weight of a majority shareholder. "My name is Ariel Chavez. For those of you who only know me as the wife of your former chief executive, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am the sole seed investor, the original software engineer, and the authentic owner of 51% of the voting shares of Apex Logistics." A senior venture capitalist named Grant, sitting to my right, picked up the packet. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. "These are copies of the original incorporation charter," Grant murmured, his tone reflecting sharp, sudden comprehension. "The signatures are certified." "Yes," I replied, keeping my gaze focused on the center of the room. "The share dilution agreement Mr. Pierce presented to this board 4 years ago was a forgery. Furthermore, the federal court has just received evidence that he has spent the last 14 months embezzling over $8 million of corporate revenue through a subsidiary shell company called Blue Ridge Ventures." A collective gasp rippled across the table. Venture capitalists can tolerate aggressive business tactics, but they despise theft, and they ruthlessly punish legal liability. Grant dropped the papers onto the table, turning a furious, searing glare toward Donovan. "You forged the equity charter," Grant snarled, his voice vibrating with rage. "You funneled $8 million of our operational capital into a phantom entity to buy beach houses for your mistress. You have exposed this entire firm to federal scrutiny." Donovan opened his mouth, a pathetic stammer escaping his lips. "Grant, I swear it was a temporary reallocation of funds. I was going to replace the capital after the buyout closed." He had just confessed. He admitted to the embezzlement in front of the entire board, destroying whatever microscopic shred of deniability he had left. I held up my hand, silencing the room. "The time for Mr. Pierce to offer excuses has expired," I stated, my tone leaving 0 room for debate. As the authenticated majority shareholder, possessing 51% of the voting rights, I am exercising my executive authority to implement an immediate corporate restructuring. I turned my head, looking directly at the broken man standing in the corner of the room. "My first official act," I announced, "is the immediate termination of Donovan Pierce. You are fired for gross corporate misconduct, fraud, and embezzlement. You are stripped of all executive titles. You will receive no severance package. You will surrender all corporate devices to security before you reach the lobby." Donovan looked like he had been physically struck. He leaned against the glass wall, seeking structural support because his own legs were failing him. Furthermore, I continued shifting my gaze back to the board. The termination extends to the individual complicit in the wire fraud scheme. Kendra Sloan is fired, effective immediately. Human Resources will ensure neither of them is permitted to step onto this property ever again." The board members nodded in swift, unanimous agreement. They were eager to amputate the infected limbs to save the host. They recognized that I was not a liability. I was the cure. I possessed the technical knowledge, the institutional memory, and the sheer ruthlessness required to navigate the impending federal audits and stabilize the company stock. I looked back at Donovan. Our eyes met for one final fleeting moment. The man who had sneered at me in the charity gala, calling me terrible with money, was now unemployed, facing prison, and watching me command the empire he falsely claimed to build. "Security is waiting for you by the elevators, Donovan," I said, my voice devoid of any pity. "Goodbye." He did not argue. He did not issue any final threats. Stripped of his forged power, his stolen money, and his fabricated narrative, he was nothing. He pushed open the heavy glass door and walked out of the boardroom, a ghost haunting the hallways of his former life. The professional domain was secure. I had reclaimed my legacy and severed the corporate infection. But as I sat at the head of the mahogany table initiating the financial triage with the board of directors, a secondary reality settled into my mind. Donovan was terminated, but he still needed to pack his bags. His sister Bridget and his mistress Kendra were currently occupying my estate, assuming they were preparing to move in. It was time to leave the glass tower and return to the Carey estate. It was time to enforce the final territorial boundary and reclaim the sanctuary they had tried to steal. The legal machinery moved with breathtaking speed once the perjury and embezzlement came to light. Elise Montgomery did not negotiate. She dictated terms. We sat in her high-rise conference room 3 days after the disastrous courtroom hearing, finalizing the divorce decree. Donovan sat across the polished mahogany table, looking like a hollow shell of the man who had cornered me in a parking garage just a week prior. He held a silver pen with trembling fingers, staring at the towering stack of settlement papers. To avoid serving decades in a federal penitentiary for forgery and corporate theft, my former husband had to make total restitution. That meant surrendering every single asset he falsely claimed as his own. He signed away his remaining minority shares in Apex Logistics. He relinquished all claims to the Carey estate. He drained his personal investment portfolios to repay the diverted funds. In exchange, Elise agreed to hold the unredacted Blue Ridge Ventures ledgers just long enough for him to secure a deferred prosecution agreement. He bought his freedom, but the price was his entire empire. The Research Triangle tech community is a close-knit ecosystem built on reputation and trust. News of his forged documents and stolen revenue circulated through the venture capital networks before the ink on our divorce papers even dried. He was instantly blacklisted. No logistics firm would hire him. No startup incubator would take his calls. He became a cautionary tale, whispered during networking luncheons. I left Elise's office with a signed decree and the physical deed to my home. The drive back to Carey felt remarkably different from the night I was evicted. I rolled the windows down, letting the warm Carolina breeze flow through the cabin. The winding roads lined with towering pine trees felt welcoming. I turned onto the familiar private drive, listening to the tires crunch over the gravel. When the sprawling Tudor-style estate came into view, a profound sense of justice settled in my chest. Parked awkwardly in the circular driveway was not a fleet of luxury vehicles or a team of premium professional movers. It was a faded yellow rental truck, featuring dented side panels and a rusting rear ramp. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the grand entryway. The front door was propped open with a heavy stone planter. Inside the foyer, the scene was a chaotic inverse of my departure. Bridget, who had stood in this exact spot, barking arrogant orders at hired men, was now sweating profusely in a stained designer blouse. She dragged a heavy cardboard box across the imported marble floor, her face flushed crimson with exertion. Beside her, Kendra Sloan struggled with a tangled roll of packing tape. The younger woman wore expensive linen slacks that were now smudged with dust and dirt. Without Donovan's stolen wealth to fund their lifestyle, they could not afford professional help. They were forced to pack his remaining personal effects themselves. I crossed the threshold. My footsteps echoed in the vaulted space. Bridget froze. She dropped her end of the heavy box, causing it to thud loudly against the floor. She looked at me, her eyes darting nervously. The snooty, status-obsessed realtor who had called me a leech just weeks ago could not muster a single insult. She wiped her brow, leaving a streak of dust across her forehead, and looked away, unable to hold my gaze. I did not offer her a greeting. I walked straight past them, navigating the maze of haphazardly packed boxes until I reached the sprawling kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows, illuminating the granite countertops. The space was quiet and pristine. I scanned the boxes stacked near the pantry. My eyes landed on a carton labeled Miscellaneous Kitchenware, written in Bridget's frantic, messy handwriting. I reached inside, shifting a stack of plastic containers and stainless steel utensils. Near the bottom, wrapped in a single sheet of cheap newspaper, I found it. The chipped ceramic coffee mug, the one adorned with crooked blue stars painted by my daughter Mia in the 3rd grade. The exact cup Bridget had carelessly tossed aside, treating it like disposable trash during my eviction. I unwrapped it, running my thumb over the familiar chipped rim. It was intact. I moved to the espresso machine resting on the counter. The grinding beans filled the silent kitchen with a rich, dark aroma. I brewed a fresh cup, the steaming liquid warming the thick ceramic. I held the mug with both hands, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast tasted like victory. Carrying my coffee, I walked back toward the foyer. Bridget was already marching down the front steps carrying a load of suits toward the rented truck. Kendra remained in the entryway holding a small box of desk ornaments. She looked up as I approached. The confident junior executive who had smirked at me during the charity gala was gone. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. Her makeup was smeared, indicating hours of frantic crying. The realization that she had narrowly escaped federal indictment for wire fraud had clearly shattered her curated facade. "Ariel," she began, her voice trembling, pitching upward into a desperate plea. "Please, you have to understand. I did not know about the forged signatures or the stolen money. Donovan lied to me. He told me he was self-made. He told me the beach houses were legitimate investments. I was just a victim of his manipulation, too." She took a step closer, hoping to elicit sympathy. She wanted to form an alliance of betrayed women. She wanted me to absolve her of the cruel, patronizing role she played when she thought she was inheriting my life. She wanted forgiveness. I stood in the doorway of my home, holding my daughter's handmade mug. I looked at the younger woman, assessing her tearful display. I did not feel anger. I did not feel pity. I felt an overwhelming, profound indifference. I took another sip of my coffee, the warm ceramic resting comfortably against my lip. I did not utter a single word of comfort. I did not offer a sharp retort or a moral lecture. Her apologies were as hollow as the man she had chosen to follow. I stepped back into the foyer. I reached out, grabbing the polished brass handle of the heavy mahogany front door. Kendra's tearful explanation faltered as she realized I was not listening. I swung the thick wooden door shut. The heavy latch clicked firmly into place, severing her from my sanctuary. The silence that followed was exquisite. I turned the deadbolt, securing the boundary of my reclaimed life. Miles away, in a less desirable neighborhood on the outskirts of Raleigh, Donovan Pierce carried a single cardboard box up 3 flights of narrow concrete stairs. He unlocked the door to a cramped, dingy apartment. The space smelled of old carpet and stale cigarette smoke. The walls were thin, allowing the sounds of distant sirens and arguing neighbors to bleed through the cheap drywall. He set his box on a stained laminate counter. He pulled out his laptop, opening it to a glowing screen. He refreshed his email inbox, hoping for a consulting gig, a freelance contract, or any lifeline from the tech sector he once ruled. The inbox remained empty. 0 new messages. He sat on a sagging thrift store sofa, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his new existence settled around him. He had traded a loyal family, a thriving empire, and a luxurious estate for a fleeting ego trip. Now he possessed nothing but the crushing weight of his own hubris. Back in Cary, I walked through the sunlit corridors of my home. The invasive presence of Bridget and Kendra was gone. The toxic shadow of Donovan's ego had been permanently excised. The house felt lighter, breathing with a renewed energy. My twins would be returning from their Asheville boarding school this weekend, and their rooms were waiting exactly as they left them. The territorial boundaries were finalized, leaving me free to gaze toward the horizon. The Civil War was over, but the corporate resurrection of Apex Logistics was just beginning. 1 year later, the morning air in downtown Raleigh carried the crisp, refreshing chill of early autumn. I stood on the expansive private balcony of my new corporate headquarters, letting the gentle North Carolina breeze brush against my face. From this high vantage point, the city stretched out below me, a vibrant grid of glass towers and historic brick buildings. Far in the western distance, beyond the sprawling suburban canopy, the faint blue ridges of the Appalachian foothills rose against the horizon. They stood silent and enduring, a beautiful reminder that the strongest foundations are formed under immense pressure. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool air. The atmosphere up here was radically different from the suffocating tension of the Cary estate or the sterile desperation of the Durham motel. Up here, the air tasted like total, unyielding independence. I turned away from the skyline and stepped back through the sliding glass doors into the executive suite. The corner office was a testament to meticulous design and quiet authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light, illuminating the rich walnut paneling and the plush slate-gray rugs. It was not a room built to intimidate guests with flashy, ostentatious wealth. It was a room designed for focused, deliberate work. I walked over to the center of the suite, where a broad, custom-built walnut desk commanded the space. Resting quietly on the far corner of that immaculate, polished surface was the vintage leather briefcase. The dark brown leather was scuffed along the edges, and the twin brass latches were slightly tarnished from age. My interior design team had politely suggested I store it in a closet or replace it with a sleek, modern portfolio. I refused. That battered briefcase held 15 years of hidden pay stubs, the original corporate charter, and the undeniable proof of my invisible labor. It remained on my desk as a permanent anchor. It was a daily reminder that true power does not reside in a shiny interface, but in the unglamorous, sturdy foundation underneath. I pulled my chair out and sat down. Resting in the center of my desk was a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, premium paper. It was a monumental domestic expansion contract. The past 12 months had been a grueling, exhilarating trial by fire. Terminating Donovan and his accomplices was merely the first tactical strike. Once the initial shockwave subsided, I had to face the reality of a tech firm hollowed out by corporate embezzlement. The board of directors was terrified. The venture capitalists were threatening to pull their funding. The employees were bracing for layoffs. I did not offer them empty, charismatic promises the way my former husband would have. I offered them mathematical certainty. I spent the first 3 months living in the server rooms and the accounting department. I personally audited every single line of code and every outgoing expenditure. I promoted Marcus, the veteran developer who risked his job to warn me about the forged documents, to the position of Chief Technology Officer. Together, we stripped the company down to its core routing logic and rebuilt the operational framework. We eradicated the bloat, closed the security vulnerabilities, and stabilized the revenue streams. Then I initiated the rebranding. The old name was tainted by scandal and hubris. I renamed the enterprise Equinox Systems, reflecting a new era of balance, transparency, and precision. The crowning achievement arrived just 2 weeks ago. I traveled to New York and stood on the balcony of the stock exchange. As the opening bell rang, signaling the initial public offering of Equinox Systems, the financial press finally learned the truth. The leading business journals ran featured profiles not on the disgraced former chief executive, but on the silent female architect who had engineered the software, saved the firm from ruin, and reclaimed her stolen empire. The stock price soared 30% on the first day of trading. I picked up a heavy silver pen from my desk. The metal was cool and grounding against my fingers. I turned to the final page of the expansion contract. This deal would integrate our routing software into the national supply chains of 3 major retail conglomerates. It was the largest singular contract in the history of the company. I pressed the pen to the signature line and signed my name. Ariel Chavez. I had legally dropped the Pierce surname the moment the divorce decree was stamped. The ink flowed smoothly, securing millions of dollars in future revenue with a few swift strokes. I set the pen down and allowed myself a warm, genuine smile. My thoughts drifted to Leo and Mia. They were 15 years old now, thriving in an environment built on honesty rather than pretense. They spent their summer vacation working at the Equinox Systems headquarters. Leo interned in the mailroom, delivering packages and learning the names of the custodial staff. He had zero interest in the luxury sports cars his father once tried to use as a bribe. He was saving his minimum wage earnings to buy a used practical sedan. Mia shadowed the software developers, discovering a natural, brilliant aptitude for coding. They were growing into grounded, intelligent young adults who respected the value of earned success over entitled bribery. They knew the truth about their mother, and that maternal bond was now entirely unbreakable. And then there was Donovan. He was a ghost, haunting the outer fringes of the Research Triangle tech scene. He lived in a cramped, noisy apartment managing his dwindling finances. Without my silent labor propping him up, his legendary business acumen was exposed as a hollow facade. He attempted to launch a consulting firm, but the industry blacklisted him. No reputable board of directors would ever risk associating with a man legally documented as a corporate fraud. He had built his entire towering ego on the myth of the self-made founder. He had looked me in the eye and called me a freeloader who never worked a day in her life. The poetic justice of the situation was flawless. The man who tried to evict me from my own home was now struggling to pay rent, while the woman he discarded owned the towering glass skyscraper that cast a shadow over the city. A soft chime from the intercom interrupted my reflection. My executive assistant informed me that the board of directors was assembled and waiting for the quarterly strategy session. I thanked her and stood up from the walnut desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer. I did not feel the need to practice a speech or compose a fake, charming smile. I simply gathered my tablet and the signed expansion contract. As I walked out of the corner office and headed down the carpeted hallway, I noticed the subtle shifts in the corporate environment. Employees did not scatter or lower their heads when I approached. They offered bright, respectful greetings. They did not fear my presence because I led with transparency instead of intimidation. They knew I understood their daily struggles because I had built the very systems they operated. I reached the heavy glass doors of the main boardroom. The seasoned venture capitalists and executive partners were sitting around the long mahogany table, reviewing their quarterly reports. When I pushed the door open, the room fell into a respectful, productive silence. They looked toward the head of the table, waiting for my guidance. For countless years, society has allowed the silent, unacknowledged labor of women to serve as the invisible foundation for the success of arrogant men. We balance the ledgers, we write the code, we raise the children, and we manage the crises, all from the shadows. We are taught to be grateful for whatever recognition we are casually handed, but silence is not a permanent condition. A foundation can only be ignored for so long before the architect decides to change the locks. I took my seat at the head of the table, placing the signed contract in the center of the wood. I looked at the brilliant, capable team assembled around me, feeling completely free and undeniably powerful. The struggle was a distant memory. The horizon was clear. I opened the financial dossier and began the meeting. There is a very specific, heavy silence that falls over a home when a mother realizes she must dismantle her children's world in order to save it. In American culture, we are deeply conditioned to worship the aesthetic of the unbroken family. We polish the granite countertops, we shuttle our kids to weekend debate tournaments and soccer games, and we smile brightly for holiday greeting cards. We wrap our lives in the warm, sometimes suffocating blanket of the American dream, believing that if the surface looks pristine, the foundation must be secure. We are taught that a traditional family structure is an impenetrable fortress, a safe harbor built on mutual respect and shared labor. But what happens when the co-architect of that fortress, the husband, the father, the supposed protector, opens the gates to deceit and expects you to quietly fade into the background? The stories we have explored, tales of 15-year betrayals, hidden pay stubs, forged documents, and public humiliations, are not just legal thrillers or dramatic tales of corporate revenge. At their absolute core, they are profound lessons in parenting. They are masterclasses in emotional awareness and the crushing weight of family responsibility. When betrayal strikes the heart of a traditional family, the immediate, visceral instinct is to fight fire with fire. When a spouse attempts to evict you from your sanctuary, steals your legacy, and replaces you with someone younger, the human impulse is to scream the truth from the rooftops. We want to pull our children close and list every sin their father has committed. We want to weaponize their affection to soothe our own agonizing wounds. Yet true family responsibility demands the exact opposite. Guiding a child through the collapse of their parents' marriage requires a superhuman level of emotional restraint. It requires a mother to swallow her rage so her children do not have to choke on it. When a father attempts to buy his son's loyalty with the promise of a luxury sports car, or when he spins fabricated tales of a mother's mental breakdown, he isn't parenting, he is campaigning. He is treating his own flesh and blood like hesitant board members who need to be bribed into compliance. But children, especially teenagers, possess a terrifyingly sharp emotional radar. They do not merely hear the words we say. They absorb how we behave under pressure. They watch how we handle injustice. This is where the true essence of long-term guidance comes into play. You do not teach a child about fairness by dragging them into the mud of adult betrayals. You teach them about fairness by maintaining your own integrity when everyone around you has abandoned theirs. By refusing to badmouth a deceitful partner, a parent does something incredibly powerful. They give their child the space to develop critical thinking. When you take the high road, you allow your children to evaluate the discrepancies in a liar's timeline on their own. You allow them to see through the awkward, cringe-worthy attempts of a mistress trying to play the cool new mom. You teach them that truth does not need a megaphone, because reality eventually always speaks for itself. It is incredibly difficult to stand in the ruins of your own life and tell your frightened child, "Just watch how the truth unfolds." But that quiet, unwavering confidence is the greatest inheritance you can ever pass down. It teaches them emotional resilience. It proves that their worth is not tied to the material wealth their father brandishes, but to the quiet, unshakable character their mother embodies. If you have ever found yourself standing in the ashes of a life you built from scratch, wondering how to protect your children from the debris without losing your own soul, you are not alone. These quiet battles of dignity and resilience happen behind closed doors in every neighborhood, every single day. I invite you to subscribe and follow Samantha Told Stories. Here, we don't just recount tales of heartbreak. We explore the quiet, unyielding strength it takes to rebuild. Join our community as we continue to share journeys of truth, justice, and the profound power of holding on to your grace when the world demands your fury. Ultimately, the most critical lesson embedded in these narratives forces us to reevaluate everything we know about the traditional American family. We are raised on a very specific, deeply ingrained philosophy regarding motherhood and marriage. Society tells us that a mother's greatest virtue is absolute sacrifice. We are subtly instructed that to be a good parent, you must lay yourself down so your children can walk over you. We are told to stay for the kids. We are told to keep the peace, to absorb the insults at charity galas, to overlook the financial discrepancies, to smile through the disrespect for the sake of preserving the family unit. But the truth is far more subversive and infinitely more dangerous to the people who rely on our silence. The most profoundly traditional family value you can impart to your child is not blind endurance. It is the absolute refusal to endure disrespect. We have been sold the lie that holding a family together means gripping it as tightly as you can, even as the glass shatters and cuts your hands to the bone. But you do not teach a child how to love by showing them how to suffer gracefully. You do not teach a son to respect women by allowing his father to treat you like a disposable placeholder. You do not teach a daughter her own worth by modeling a life of quiet, miserable submission. Sometimes the only way to save your children is to let the illusion of their perfect family shatter entirely. The greatest gift you can give a child is not a seamless, unbroken childhood, but the authentic blueprint of how to survive a broken one. You teach them how to love by showing them how to pack a suitcase, stand in the center of a stolen room, and walk out the front door with your spine perfectly straight. True parenting is not about shielding your children from the darkness of the world. It is about showing them how to become their own source of light when the people they trusted decide to turn out the stars.